I asked my husband what time we should come over tomorrow, and our 5-year-old son whispered asking if his grandmother would like his handmade card. But my husband went completely quiet as his mother stepped up and told me they already did Christmas yesterday. Then my husband added that the holiday was much better without the two of us there, so I looked at them and simply said, "That was very good to know," before pulling out my tablet and asking him one simple question about his corporate email inbox, causing his arrogant mother to immediately stop laughing as their entire world collapsed. The morning air in Atlanta was bitterly cold. As I stood on the massive front porch of the Buckhead estate holding the small, warm hand of my son Leo, as the giant oak, double doors in front of us, felt like the heavy gates to a medieval fortress, designed specifically to keep people like me out of their elite world, while Leo shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his little boots tapping softly against the pristine slate tiles of the porch, clutching a piece of folded red construction paper in his free hand, which was a handmade Christmas card, decorated with uneven silver glitter, and a wobbly drawing of a green pine tree that he had spent 2 solid hours working on at our kitchen table the night before, making absolutely sure the star on top was perfectly colored with his favorite yellow crayon, because he desperately wanted to give it to his grandmother and just wanted to belong to this family. I took a deep breath and let the freezing winter air fill my lungs, because for 5 long years I had played their exhausting and demeaning game, smiling politely, while my mother-in-law Beatrice insulted my working-class Southside Atlanta roots and keeping my mouth firmly shut when my husband Desmond played the role of a brilliant corporate executive, while he secretly ran his century-old family legacy straight into the ground, enduring the snide remarks, the passive-aggressive dinner party comments, and the blatant cruel exclusion. But looking down at Leo, whose big brown eyes were filled with innocent hope, I knew the game was officially over, and the time for playing the submissive and grateful wife had completely passed. So I pressed the glowing doorbell, listening as the rich melodic chime echoed deep inside the cavernous, perfectly decorated mansion. We waited in total silence as the winter wind whipped around us, biting harshly at my cheeks, making Leo press closer to my leg, seeking warmth and reassurance in the freezing cold. So I adjusted the thick collar of his winter coat, keeping my face perfectly neutral and calm, while minutes passed slowly, dragging on like hours, until finally the heavy brass lock clicked loudly and the massive oak door swung inward, revealing Desmond standing there wearing a luxurious silk robe over his expensive designer pajamas, his eyes bloodshot from heavy drinking, and looking incredibly annoyed by our mere presence on his doorstep, as he did not look down at his young son, but looked directly at me with an expression of pure exhaustion and blatant irritation, offering no warmth, no welcoming greeting, and absolutely no holiday cheer, representing only the cold, hard reality of a selfish man who despised the family he had created. I kept my voice completely calm and perfectly even as I spoke to him, saying, "Good morning, Desmond. I asked you yesterday what time we should come over today for the family gift exchange. But you never replied to my text messages or returned my phone calls." Desmond let out a heavy, dramatic sigh and rubbed the bridge of his nose, as if the mere sound of my voice was giving him a massive migraine, replying that they were extremely busy. Naomi in the house was a complete mess from the holiday party last night, and everyone was still trying to recover from the long evening, so they were not doing guests today, meaning I needed to turn around and leave right now. The word guests struck me like a physical blow to the chest, because we were not unexpected guests. We were his legal wife and his biological son. But before I could formulate a response, Leo stepped forward, holding up his glittery red construction paper, his small voice trembling slightly in the cold air, because he had always been a deeply shy child, struggling with a severe speech delay that Beatrice constantly weaponized against us, claiming he was mentally defective and an embarrassment to their prestigious bloodline, as he whispered, asking will Grandma like my card while pushing the colorful paper toward his tall father. Desmond looked down at the handmade card without smiling or crouching down to meet his young son at eye level to offer a warm hug or a simple word of thanks, but instead snatched the construction paper from Leo's small hands with a swift, impatient, and highly aggressive gesture, glancing at the uneven drawing and scoffing loudly, making his absolute disdain crystal clear to both of us, standing there on the cold porch, before casually dropping the card, letting it flutter through the freezing air to land face down on the cold marble floor of the grand foyer, scattering the silver glitter across the pristine stone surface, making a tiny tragic mess. He coldly stated without a single ounce of fatherly affection that it looked like cheap trash. Leo adding that I knew his mother did not like cheap things, cluttering up her beautiful house, causing Leo to flinch and step backward rapidly, hiding his small face against my heavy winter coat, which turned my blood to absolute ice in my veins, as the fierce maternal instinct to protect my innocent child roared to life inside my chest, completely drowning out any lingering desire to keep the peace or save this hopelessly broken marriage, as I looked at the discarded card on the marble floor and then up at the pathetic man I had married. Just then, the sharp clicking of expensive heels echoed from the grand winding staircase inside the mansion, and Beatrice Pierce glided into view, wearing a flowing silk designer caftan, holding a crystal flute filled with a morning mimosa, her hair perfectly styled, and her expression painted with that signature elitist disdain. She reserved exclusively for me and my son, stepping up right behind Desmond and placing a perfectly manicured hand on his broad shoulder, demanding to know what all this ridiculous noise at the front door was, while looking me up and down from head to toe as if I were a lost delivery driver who had accidentally come to the main entrance instead of the service door, stating clearly that they did their family Christmas yesterday. Naomi having a lovely formal dinner with the corporate board members and the real family. Desmond crossed his arms over his chest, puffing himself up to look intimidating, adding cruelly that it was so much better without the two of us there, ensuring the words cut as deep as possible, and explaining that they actually got to enjoy the elegant evening without constantly worrying about my ghetto Southside habits, or Leo throwing one of his awkward silent tantrums in front of the wealthy investors. I stared at them, taking in the sheer breathtaking audacity of their unprovoked cruelty, standing there in their multi-million-dollar mansion, genuinely believing they were untouchable gods among mere mortals. Thinking my quiet silence over the past 5 years was a clear sign of intellectual weakness and social submission, assuming I was just a lucky girl from the working-class neighborhoods who should be infinitely grateful to share their prestigious last name, entirely missing the critical fact that the quiet girl they mocked relentlessly had clawed her way to the absolute top of the corporate restructuring world through pure brilliance and relentless grit, becoming a senior corporate liquidator and a ruthless predator in the financial markets who specialized in aggressively dismantling failing business empires. Meaning right now, I was looking directly at the most fragile, failing, and pathetic empire of them all. I told them that was good to know, keeping my voice completely lacking any trace of the heartbreak or devastation they clearly expected to see on my face, adding that I was very glad they enjoyed their exclusive holiday dinner. Beatrice took a slow, deliberate, and arrogant sip of her mimosa, her dark eyes narrowing sharply as she stared at me with pure, unadulterated venom and deeply rooted classist hatred, harshly commanding that, since I was already standing there ruining her peaceful morning, we should get straight down to business, assuming I brought the legal paperwork Desmond sent over to me late last night. She was talking about the highly critical spousal property waiver that Desmond had emailed to me late on Christmas Eve, demanding I sign it immediately, without asking any questions or consulting my own attorney, because Pierce Holdings, the century-old family real estate and investment firm, had been bleeding millions of dollars for years, under Desmond, remarkably incompetent leadership, leaving them desperately needing a massive emergency commercial loan to cover their daily operational costs and avoid defaulting completely on their existing aggressive creditors, which, due to strict state laws requiring spousal consent for certain types of asset leveraging, meant they desperately needed my signature on that exact document to pledge the Buckhead estate and the downtown corporate headquarters as collateral for the new loan, wanting me to foolishly sign away any legal claim or financial protection I had, so they could gamble wildly with the last remaining tangible assets of their fading legacy. Desmond snapped, asking if I signed it while tapping his bare foot impatiently against the cold marble, explaining that the bank absolutely needed that waiver by noon today to release the emergency funds to their corporate accounts, and they could not afford any banking delays just because I decided to be difficult and stubborn this morning. Beatrice scoffed loudly, waving her free hand dismissively in the air, stating that of course I signed the document, Desmond, because I knew much better than to bite the wealthy hand that generously fed me and kept a luxury roof over my head, sneering with her true terrible colors fully on display as she ordered me to sign it. Hand it over right now, and then take my defective kid back to the Southside slums where I belonged. Naomi, because I had significantly overstayed my welcome in their prestigious zip code, the sheer blinding entitlement radiating from the two of them was almost cinematic in its absolute perfection, genuinely believing I existed only to serve their financial needs and absorb their daily emotional abuse without a single complaint. But I looked down at my sweet Leo, who was trembling quietly, clutching the thick fabric of my coat, his big brown eyes welling with unshed tears, knowing he did not deserve to hear another single word of their toxic elite poison. So I knelt down smoothly and gracefully on the freezing cold porch, maintaining my perfect professional posture, and picked up his fallen Christmas card from the marble floor, carefully wiping a speck of dirt from the glittery star. I tucked the beautiful red card safely into my expensive designer handbag, ensuring it was fully protected from their sight, then smoothed his collar gently and smiled warmly at him, making absolutely sure he saw no fear, sadness, or intimidation in my eyes, before gently placing my hands over his small ears, pressing firmly enough to completely muffle the harsh sound of the cruel world around us. Standing up tall, keeping my hands securely over my son ears, locking my eyes with Desmond, and then slowly shifting my intense, unblinking gaze to Beatrice, knowing the friendly, accommodating, and quiet daughter-in-law they had known for years was completely dead and gone, replaced by the apex predator of the Atlanta financial sector, fully ready to strike. I softly stated that I did not sign the spousal waiver. Desmond keeping my voice smooth, cold, and absolutely lethal. Desmond's face immediately contorted with explosive, uncontrollable rage, demanding to know what I meant by not signing the paperwork, asking if I was completely out of my mind. Naomi, and if I had any idea what was currently at stake here, screaming that the lenders would pull the entire term sheet immediately if they did not have that signed waiver in their hands today, because he needed that massive injection of capital to keep the holding company afloat and pay their angry vendors. I tilted my head slightly to the side, studying his rising panic with profound clinical detachment, informing him that he did not have a holding company anymore. Desmond, and he did not have any corporate lenders anymore either, pausing purposefully, letting the heavy silence stretch between us for a fleeting but terrifying second, as his breathing stopped entirely before asking him to tell me if he even bothered to check his corporate email regarding the Pierce Holdings debt restructuring this morning, or if he was too busy recovering from his lavish holiday party to look at his extremely important inbox. Desmond frowned deeply, his bloodshot eyes darting back and forth in sudden panicked confusion, asking what I was talking about. Naomi, and what specific email? Beatrice stepped forward aggressively, her grip tightening dangerously on her crystal glass, snapping at me to stop playing these stupid games with her son, calling me an ungrateful little gold digger, and demanding to know what exactly I did. I removed one hand from Leo's ear, just long enough to reach into my deep coat pocket, smoothly pulling out my tablet, the sleek black device that literally held the digital keys to their absolute and total financial destruction, tapping the high-resolution screen, once pulling up the highly classified financial documents I had finalized at 3 in the morning while they were sleeping off their expensive champagne. I repeated that I did not sign a spousal waiver, my voice ringing out loud and clear in the freezing morning air, slicing through their arrogance like a perfectly sharpened blade, revealing that I signed a formal notice of foreclosure. Desmond stopped breathing, and Beatrice lowered her glass, the smug, arrogant smirk completely wiped from her aging face. I explained to Desmond that his precious old moneylenders got incredibly tired of waiting for him to fix a rapidly sinking ship, so they bundled all of the toxic debt from Pierce Holdings, taking his defaulted commercial mortgages, the over-leveraged credit lines, the unpaid vendor invoices, and the penalty fees, putting all of it up for sale on the secondary market, where my private equity firm bought every single penny of it at a steep discount late last night while they were busy drinking and celebrating without us. Desmond stammered, taking a clumsy step backward into the foyer, his voice breathless, high-pitched and utterly terrified, accusing me of lying and claiming I did not have that kind of capital because I was just a middle manager in a basic restructuring firm and could not possibly afford to buy their debt. I stated coldly, watching the devastating realization completely crush his massive fragile ego, that I own the firm. Desmond confirming I am the sole managing partner and his only creditor, now explaining that because he foolishly missed the 30-day cure period on his primary commercial loan, I executed an immediate call on the collateral, meaning I own the downtown corporate building, I own the subsidiary bank accounts, and as of 8 o'clock this morning, I officially own the deed to this Buckhead estate. Beatrice opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out, her throat working uselessly as the reality of her sudden poverty crashed down upon her, just as a sharp, loud ping echoed from her silk pocket, prompting her to slowly reach in with shaking hands and pull out her smartphone, watching her eyes scan the notification on her bright screen from American Express, directly informing her that her exclusive black card had been permanently frozen due to severe corporate insolvency and total default, causing the expensive crystal flute to slip from her trembling fingers and shatter violently against the marble floor, mingling perfectly with the scattered silver glitter from Leo's discarded Christmas card. I told them they had exactly 30 minutes to pack a bag and vacate my property, turning my back on them and guiding my son carefully away from the wreckage of their lives, confirming their time was officially up. The heavy silence that followed my announcement was suddenly shattered by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of expensive leather shoes descending the grand, sweeping staircase of the mansion. I did not even need to turn my head to know exactly who was making their grand entrance into this spectacular morning disaster. Camille, my husband's younger sister, and her husband Trent Sterling were finally joining the party, having clearly taken their sweet time waking up in one of the luxury guest suites. Camille appeared first, draped in a ridiculous floor-length silk robe that cost more than my first car, her hair perfectly smoothed, and her expression twisted into a permanent scowl of aristocratic annoyance. Right behind her walked Trent, a man who had always worn his white corporate privilege like a suffocating heavy cologne that choked the life out of every room he entered. Trent was a hedge fund manager who had married into this prominent black family and immediately appointed himself the ultimate financial savior of the Pierce legacy, acting as though his mere presence elevated their historical status. He stepped off the final stair, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored charcoal suit with a practiced, effortless arrogance, looking down his nose at the scene unfolding in the foyer. His pale blue eyes swept over my son Leo, who was still hiding his face against my heavy winter coat, and then his gaze landed squarely on me, lingering for a deeply disrespectful second on my thick, natural hair. It was a look I knew all too well, a look filled with silent, aggressive judgment, meant to remind me that no matter how much money I made or how many corporate acquisitions I successfully managed, I would always just be a working-class girl from the south side of Atlanta in his eyes. Trent let out a condescending little chuckle, a sound so perfectly calculated to make me feel small and insignificant, as he moved to stand beside Desmond, offering his brother-in-law a pat on the back, as if to say the adults were here to handle the situation now. He slipped his hands into his suit pockets and leaned forward slightly, adopting the tone of a tired kindergarten teacher, explaining basic arithmetic to a particularly slow student. "Naomi, you really need to calm down and stop embarrassing yourself," he said, his voice dripping with unbearable condescension as he intentionally mispronounced my name just a fraction to assert dominance. "You cannot just march into a Buckhead estate and start throwing around legal terms you clearly do not understand. Foreclosure is a very big word for someone who spent her 20s answering phones and fetching coffee." He looked over at Beatrice, who was still staring in absolute horror at her frozen American Express card, and offered her a reassuring nod before turning his condescending gaze back to me. "You see, Naomi, the world of high finance does not operate like the local pawn shops you grew up around. You cannot use your ghetto Southside intimidation tactics on complex corporate law. It simply does not work that way, and frankly, it is highly embarrassing to watch you try." I kept my hands gently pressed against Leo's ears, making sure my precious son could not hear the racist, classist garbage falling from Trent's mouth. Trent took another step forward, invading my personal space, trying to use his height to intimidate me. But I simply stared straight through him, my posture perfectly straight and my expression completely unbothered. I managed the Pierce family trust. Naomi. He continued, his voice growing louder and more aggressive as my absolute silence clearly began to unnerve him. I control the assets, the liquidity, and the legal protections of this entire legacy. I know every single loophole and every single protective measure put in place to keep people exactly like you from getting their greedy hands on what belongs to this family. If you do not turn around and walk out that door right this very second, taking your ridiculous fake foreclosure notice with you, I will personally have the FBI on your doorstep for extortion and corporate espionage before you even manage to start your car. The sheer, unadulterated confidence in his voice was almost impressive. Trent actually believed he was the smartest person in the room, genuinely convinced that his fancy degree and his hedge fund title made him completely untouchable. He expected me to cower. He expected me to apologize. He expected me to remember my place and back down, just like the rest of the Pierce family always did whenever he started throwing around federal agency acronyms and empty legal threats. Desmond was nodding along with Trent, looking suddenly emboldened by his brother-in-law's aggressive stance, while Camille crossed her arms and smirked, clearly enjoying the show. Even Beatrice seemed to recover a tiny fraction of her shattered composure, straightening her posture as she waited for me to break under the pressure of Trent's supposedly terrifying ultimatum. Instead of breaking, I did something that completely destroyed the tense atmosphere in the grand foyer. I laughed. I did not just chuckle or smile. I let out a loud, genuine ringing laugh that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of the mansion and bounced against the crystal chandelier hanging above us. It was a laugh of pure, unfiltered amusement and absolute predatory triumph. The sound was so jarring, so completely unexpected, that Trent actually took a physical step backward, his arrogant smirk vanishing instantly to be replaced by a look of profound confusion. The sound of my laughter seemed to slice through the remaining confidence in the room, leaving them all staring at me, as if I had suddenly lost my mind. "You find federal extortion charges funny?" Naomi Trent demanded, his voice losing its smooth, confident edge and cracking just slightly with genuine irritation. I stopped laughing and slowly dropped my hands from Leo's ears, knowing the upcoming conversation was no longer something I needed to shield him from. I reached into my designer handbag, the same bag where I had carefully tucked away Leo's ruined Christmas card, and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope that felt like a brick of solid gold in my hands. I looked Trent dead in the eyes, watching the faint beginnings of panic start to form in the corners of his pale blue eyes. "The family trust?" I asked, my voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous whisper that carried clearly across the silent foyer. "Is that what we are calling it these days, Trent?" I took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance he had tried to put between us. "You want to talk to me about the Pierce family trust? You want to threaten me with the FBI? I think that is a fantastic idea, Trent. I really do. In fact, I think we should call the federal authorities right now and have a very long, very detailed conversation about the management of this prestigious legacy." I suddenly raised my arm and threw the thick manila envelope directly at Trent's chest. It hit him with a satisfying heavy thud, forcing him to instinctively bring his hands up to catch it before it fell to the marble floor. He stared down at the unmarked envelope, as if I had just handed him a live grenade, his face draining of all color. Desmond and Camille exchanged confused glances while Beatrice watched with narrowed, suspicious eyes. "What is this?" Trent asked, his voice barely a whisper, his previous bravado completely evaporating into the cold morning air. "Open it!" I commanded, my voice echoing with absolute authority. "Go ahead, Trent. Open the envelope and explain to your beautiful wife, your supportive mother-in-law, and your incredibly incompetent brother-in-law exactly how well you have been managing the Pierce family trust." Trent's hands were visibly shaking as he clumsily tore open the top of the envelope, pulling out a thick stack of bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and highly classified offshore financial tracking documents that my corporate investigation team had spent the last 3 weeks meticulously compiling. I did not wait for him to read them. I knew exactly what every single page said. You mean the $3 million you wired into a totally untraceable shell company in the Cayman Islands last Tuesday? I asked, my words hitting the silent room like a series of rapid-fire explosions. Trent Head snapped up his eyes wide with absolute sheer terror as he looked at me. Oh yes, Trent, I know all about the shell company. I know about the offshore accounts. And more importantly, I know exactly why you stole $3 million from the family you claim to protect so fiercely. Camille stepped forward, her perfectly manicured hands trembling as she looked at her husband. Trent, what is she talking about? Camille asked, her voice rising in panic. What shell company? What $3 million? Trent could not speak. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He just stared at the documents in his hands, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. I turned my attention to Camille, keeping my tone cold and clinical. Your brilliant husband Camille, the man who just threatened to call the FBI on me, has an underground gambling addiction that he has been hiding from you for the entirety of your 5-year marriage. He owes massive dangerous debts to some very unpleasant people in Macau and Las Vegas. When his own hedge fund fired him quietly 3 months ago. A fun little fact he conveniently forgot to mention to this family, he realized he was going to lose everything. So he used his position as the manager of the Pierce Family Trust to authorize a massive illegal wire transfer to cover his gambling debts, leaving the trust completely bankrupt. The silence that followed my revelation was deafening. It was the kind of absolute total silence that only happens when a massive foundational lie is violently exposed to the light of day. Camille stared at Trent, her eyes wide with horror and disbelief. She reached out and snatched the documents from his shaking hands, her eyes scanning the highlighted wire transfers and the offshore account numbers that clearly showed her husband had completely drained her family generational wealth to save his own skin. You stole from us! Camille screamed, the sound tearing through the grand foyer like a physical weapon. You stole my grandmother money. You stole my trust fund. You stood there and told us you were protecting our assets while you were bleeding us dry. Trent tried to reach out to her, his hands shaking violently as he babbled pathetic excuses, claiming it was just a temporary loan and that he was going to put the money back as soon as his next big investment cleared. But Camille slapped his hands away, her face contorted with absolute fury. Desmond, who had been standing frozen in shock, suddenly lunged forward, grabbing Trent by the lapels of his expensive tailored suit. You son of a bitch, Desmond roared, slamming Trent back against the heavy wooden wall of the staircase. You told me the trust was locked up in long-term bonds. You told me I could not access the capital to save the holding company because of tax penalties. You let my company default on its commercial loans so you could pay off your gambling debts. The scene devolved into absolute pure chaos. The picture-perfect, wealthy, elegant Pierce family was violently tearing each other apart right in front of my eyes. Desmond was shaking Trent violently, screaming curses in his face, while Camille battered her fists against Trent's back, crying hysterically about her stolen inheritance and her ruined social standing. The mask of high society, black excellence they wore so proudly, had been completely ripped away, revealing the desperate, greedy, and treacherous reality underneath. I stood calmly in the center of the destruction, holding Leo's hand, watching the empire devour itself. I did not need to raise my voice or throw a single punch. I had simply handed them the truth and let their own toxic greed do the rest of the work for me. But as I watched Desmond and Trent grapple near the stairs, my eyes flicked over to Beatrice Pierce, and I realized the matriarch of the family had been unusually quiet. Beatrice was standing rigidly by the console table, her face ash-gray, her chest heaving as she watched her son and son-in-law destroy each other. She looked down at her frozen black card, still resting on the floor, then over to the documents scattered around Camille's feet, and finally her eyes met mine. In that fleeting second, I saw the absolute horrifying realization wash over her. She knew it was over. She knew the money was gone. She knew the company was mine. She knew her house was gone. The grand illusion she had spent her entire life protecting was completely shattered, and she had absolutely no cards left to play against me. But Beatrice Pierce was nothing if not a brilliant manipulative survivor. When backed into a corner, she knew exactly how to change the narrative and shift the blame. As the reality of her total destruction settled in her eyes, widened dramatically, and she let out a loud, piercing gasp that cut through the sounds of Desmond and Trent fighting. She suddenly clutched her chest with both hands, her face twisting into a mask of pure agonizing pain. Desmond. She gasped, her voice weak and strained perfectly, imitating a woman in the throes of a massive cardiac event. Desmond, help me, I cannot breathe. She stumbled forward, knocking a heavy crystal vase off the console table, sending it crashing to the floor as her knees buckled. She collapsed onto the cold marble tiles, gasping for air, her hands grasping weakly at her chest as she put on the absolute performance of a lifetime, fighting to buy herself time and distract from the financial slaughter I had just unleashed upon them. Desmond dropped Trent immediately, his anger instantly replaced by blinding panic as he rushed to his mother's side, dropping to his knees on the floor. Mom! Mom, hold on. He yelled frantically, loosening the collar of her silk caftan while Camille screamed in the background, completely forgetting about her stolen trust fund in the face of this new, terrifying medical emergency. I stood perfectly still, watching the pathetic theatrical display. I knew she was faking it. Her breathing was too controlled, her collapse too carefully executed to avoid any real injury. It was a desperate, pathetic attempt to pause the clock to create an emergency that would force me out of the house and cast me as the ultimate villain of the morning. Desmond looked up from his mother, sighed, his eyes wild and furious as he pointed a shaking finger directly at me. Call 911, he screamed at Camille, his voice echoing with desperate rage. Call the police right now. She did this. Naomi did this. She just tried to murder my mother. I simply smiled down at him, my expression colder than the winter wind, howling outside the heavy oak doors, knowing this fake medical emergency was just another desperate delay tactic in a war they had already lost. I pulled my phone from my pocket and prepared to make a call of my own, fully ready to escalate this battle to the absolute limit. The piercing wail of police sirens suddenly shattered the crisp morning air outside the massive mansion, echoing loudly across the sprawling green lawns of the Buckhead estate, signaling the backup Desmond had desperately demanded. I stood my ground firmly in the grand foyer, holding my phone as the heavy oak front doors were shoved open with aggressive force, revealing 3 armed Atlanta police officers storming into the house. Leading the pack was a commanding officer, whose name badge read Sergeant Miller. A man I immediately recognized from the numerous charity galas Beatrice used to host in this room. Sergeant Miller was a well-known fixture on the Pierce family unofficial payroll, a very corrupt local cop who spent his off-duty hours running private security for their events and eagerly accepting thick envelopes of cash to bury their legal indiscretions. His eyes scanned the chaotic scene, taking in the shattered vase, the scattered financial documents, and Beatrice, who was still putting on a theatrical performance, gasping for air and clutching her chest while sprawled awkwardly against the base of the staircase. Desmond scrambled to his feet, his face red and slick with nervous sweat, rushing toward the officers, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face, screaming that I had violently broken into their home and brutally attacked his elderly mother. He told Sergeant Miller I was a deranged former employee attempting to extort millions of dollars from his trust, and that my violent actions had triggered a massive heart attack, killing the matriarch of their family. Sergeant Miller did not ask a single question or attempt to assess the situation with professional objectivity, but instead immediately reached for the metal handcuffs resting on his belt, his face twisting into an ugly mask of arrogant authority as he marched toward me. He loudly declared I was being placed under immediate arrest for elder abuse, criminal trespassing, and felony extortion, deliberately neglecting to read me my rights or ask for my side of the story, because he was merely acting as a hired thug rather than an officer of the law. Camille wiped away her fake tears, crossing her arms over her expensive silk robe, a cruel, triumphant smirk spreading across her face as she watched the corrupt officer advance, clearly believing her family had finally regained the upper hand by weaponizing the police force against a woman from the South Side. Trent was leaning against the wall, breathing heavily from his physical altercation with Desmond, but he managed to let out a weak, condescending laugh, entirely convinced the brutal reality of the legal system was about to put me back in my proper place. I did not flinch when Sergeant Miller grabbed my arm, with unnecessary rough force twisting it to demonstrate his physical dominance, while demanding I surrender my phone and place my hands behind my back immediately. I simply looked him dead in the eyes and calmly informed him that making a false arrest on a federal property owner outside his legal jurisdiction was going to cost him his shiny badge, his pension, and quite possibly his freedom. Sergeant Miller scoffed loudly, tightening his painful grip on my arm, telling me to shut my mouth because a ghetto girl playing corporate dress-up was not going to intimidate a veteran of the Atlanta Police Department. Desmond sneered, stepping closer to mock me, stating no amount of fake restructuring documents or stolen offshore bank statements could save me now, because the Pierce family owned this city, and the people who protected it, meaning I was going to rot in a holding cell. Beatrice let out a dramatic groan from the floor, demanding the officers get the dangerous animal out of her house immediately so paramedics could enter and treat her failing heart. I kept my breathing perfectly steady, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me sweat because I knew my ultimate counterstrike was already walking up the front steps of the estate. Just as Sergeant Miller unclipped his handcuffs and prepared to forcefully secure my wrists behind my back, the heavy oak doors swung open for a second time, hitting the interior walls with a deafening explosive crash, making everyone in the room jump in sheer terror. Standing in the doorway, like an absolute force of nature, was Darius Cole, my personal attorney and one of the most ruthless, highly feared federal litigators in the state of Georgia. A man who built his legendary career entirely by dismantling corrupt institutions and destroying arrogant old money families in federal court. Darius stepped into the grand foyer, wearing a sharp, bespoke midnight blue suit, holding a thick leather briefcase, and flanking him on either side were four heavily armed United States federal marshals wearing tactical gear with their gold badges gleaming brightly in the morning light. The sudden massive shift in power was instantaneous and breathtaking to witness as the arrogant local police officers instantly froze their hands, dropping away from their weapons, realizing they were suddenly standing in the presence of overwhelming federal authority. Sergeant Miller immediately released my arm and took a rapid, stumbling step backward, his face draining of all color as he recognized Darius Cole, knowing exactly what kind of legal slaughter the man was capable of orchestrating. Darius walked straight past the trembling local officers without giving them a single glance, moving directly to the ornate console table where he slammed a thick stack of verified legal documents down onto the polished wood surface with a loud, authoritative crack. He adjusted his glasses and looked at the corrupt sergeant, informing him in a cold, booming voice that he was currently standing on privately owned commercial property, completely controlled by the Naomi Pierce global restructuring firm, and that any local officer attempting to arrest the legal owner of said property without a federal warrant would be immediately charged with criminal civil rights violations and federal obstruction. Sergeant Miller stuttered defensively, pointing a shaky hand toward Desmond and claiming he had received a distressed 911 call from the homeowner regarding a violent home invasion and elder abuse, meaning he was just doing his sworn duty to protect the wealthy citizens of Buckhead. Darius did not even blink, pulling a verified federal injunction from the top of his stack and shoving it directly into the chest of the corrupt police officer, explaining that Desmond Pierce was no longer the homeowner, but rather a hostile squatter actively trespassing on federal collateral, and warning the sergeant that if he did not command his men to stand down and exit the premises, immediately the federal marshals flanking the door would gladly arrest the entire local squad for interfering with a federal asset seizure. The federal marshals took a synchronized step forward, their hands resting casually but purposefully on their tactical belts. A silent but absolutely terrifying confirmation that they were fully prepared to execute Darius' threats. Sergeant Miller swallowed hard, looking desperately at Desmond for guidance. But Desmond was completely paralyzed with fear, his mouth hanging open as he stared at the federal badges, realizing his local bribes and country club connections meant absolutely nothing against the overwhelming, crushing power of the federal government. Without another word, Sergeant Miller signaled to his men, and the three local officers quickly backed out the front door, retreating to their patrol cars like frightened dogs with their tails tucked firmly between their legs, leaving the Pierce family completely stripped of their armed protection. The silence in the grand foyer returned heavier and more oppressive than ever before, as the reality of their absolute defeat finally crushed the last remaining fragments of their arrogant delusions. Beatrice, who was still laying on the marble floor, suddenly stopped gasping and groaning, her fake heart attack momentarily forgotten, as she stared in wide-eyed horror at the federal marshals standing guard inside her former home. The wail of a new siren pierced the air, and a team of local emergency paramedics rushed through the open front doors, rolling a stretcher between them, completely unaware of the massive legal war zone they were entering. They rushed to Beatrice's side, preparing to load her onto the stretcher, while she weakly protested, claiming she was suddenly feeling much better and did not actually need to go to the hospital anymore because she was terrified of leaving the estate unattended. Darius looked down at her and smiled a cold, shark-like grin, advising the paramedics that the elderly woman had just suffered a severe cardiac event caused by extreme financial distress and required immediate intense medical observation at the downtown hospital facility, demanding they transport her without delay. Beatrice was forced to maintain her own pathetic charade, unable to refuse medical treatment without admitting she had lied to the police, so she was strapped to the gurney and wheeled out the front door, her eyes filled with helpless, burning rage as she was loaded into the back of the waiting ambulance and driven away from the empire she had spent her entire life ruthlessly protecting. Camille and Trent were backed into a corner of the foyer, completely silenced by the terrifying display of federal power, knowing they were next on the chopping block if they made a single wrong move. Darius turned his attention to me, opening his briefcase to hand me a pen and the final execution orders for the property seizure, quietly congratulating me on a perfectly executed morning and asking me to review the final addendums regarding the freezing of the subsidiary corporate accounts. I took the heavy pen and began reviewing the dense legal paperwork, feeling a deep, profound sense of accomplishment wash over me as the weight of 5 years of emotional abuse was finally lifted from my shoulders, knowing I had successfully dismantled the toxic family that had tried to destroy me. I stood near the console table, signing my name on the dotted lines, completely focused on securing the financial destruction of Pierce Holdings, while the federal marshals monitored the remaining family members, ensuring no one attempted to destroy any physical evidence left in the house. The intense focus required to navigate the complex corporate documents distracted me for just a few critical minutes, a brief but terrible lapse in my otherwise flawless maternal vigilance. I signed the final page and handed the thick stack of papers back to Darius, letting out a long, slow breath before turning around to check on my sweet son, who had been standing quietly by the base of the staircase, holding his small backpack. The space by the stairs was completely empty. A sudden violent jolt of pure ice-cold panic struck my chest, paralyzing my lungs as my eyes frantically scanned the massive grand foyer, looking behind the federal marshals, looking past Camille and Trent. But my sweet, shy little boy was absolutely nowhere to be found. I screamed, "Leo name!" My voice cracking with raw, terrified desperation, echoing off the high vaulted ceilings, but there was no response. Darius dropped his briefcase immediately, recognizing the sheer terror in my eyes, as we both realized Desmond was also missing from the room, having vanished silently during the chaotic arrival of the paramedics and the federal marshals. A loud, aggressive screeching of heavy tires burning against asphalt erupted from the circular driveway outside, snapping my head toward the open front doors, just in time to see Desmond Black, luxury SUV tearing recklessly out of the estate gates and speeding dangerously onto the main road. My phone vibrated in my pocket, emitting a sharp buzzing sound that felt like a physical electric shock. I pulled it out with violently shaking hands and stared at the bright screen, seeing a new text message from Desmond that made the blood freeze completely in my veins. The chilling message demanded that I drop the foreclosure immediately, or I would never see my flawed kid again, boasting sicky that he had a corrupt judge sitting comfortably in his pocket. I stared down at the glowing screen of my smartphone, reading the pathetic, threatening text message from Desmond over and over again, as the harsh reality of his desperate kidnapping attempt settled into the silent grand foyer. Any ordinary mother would have fallen to her knees, weeping and screaming in sheer panic at the thought of a hostile, corrupt family judge taking her child away forever. but I simply locked my phone screen and slid it back into my heavy winter coat pocket. Darius stepped forward, his sharp federal litigator instincts immediately recognizing the dangerous shift in my demeanor, asking me in a low, serious voice what Desmond had done and if we needed to deploy the federal marshals to initiate a citywide Amber Alert. I shook my head slowly, looking up at the high vaulted ceilings of the Buckhead estate, feeling an icy calm wash over my entire body as I informed my attorney that deploying local or federal law enforcement would only give Desmond the media circus he desperately craved. I explained to Darius that Desmond was a predictable coward who always relied on empty threats, meaning I knew exactly how to find him right now today. For the past 3 years, I had watched Beatrice and Desmond systematically break down my sweet son using his speech delay as an excuse to isolate him and treat him like a defective burden to their precious old money legacy. Knowing exactly how treacherous and vindictive the Pierce family could be when backed into a financial corner, I had taken extreme protective measures long before I ever initiated the hostile takeover of their failing corporate empire. I reached into my handbag and pulled out my secondary secure mobile device, opening a highly encrypted tracking application that immediately displayed a bright flashing red dot moving rapidly down the interstate toward the heart of the city. I looked at Darius and explained that 6 months ago when I bought Leo his specialized orthopedic shoes to help with his slight physical imbalances, I had a private security firm, so a microscopic military-grade GPS tracking chip deep inside the thick rubber sole of his left shoe. I knew Desmond was far too arrogant and self-absorbed to ever notice a tiny tracking device, meaning we had a perfect real-time map on the screen, leading straight to his pathetic hiding spot right now. Darius let out a low whistle of genuine professional admiration, realizing just how deeply I had planned every single move in this ruthless corporate and personal war, telling me we needed to move right now before Desmond had time to secure his position. We sprinted out the front doors of the mansion, leaving the remaining federal marshals behind, to secure the foreclosed property, and rushed down the sprawling driveway toward Darius' sleek black sedan, parked near the heavy iron gates. The freezing winter wind bit harshly at my face as I jumped into the passenger seat, keeping my eyes glued to the tracking application on my screen, watching the red dot slow down and exit the highway, heading directly into the upscale Midtown district of Atlanta. Darius slammed his foot on the accelerator, pulling the powerful car out onto the main road and navigating the heavy holiday traffic with aggressive precision, weaving between slower vehicles, while I called out turn-by-turn directions based on the satellite data. The very long drive felt like it lasted an absolute eternity, but my heart remained perfectly steady because I was no longer a victim waiting for permission to exist anymore in silence. I was a mother hunting down the weak man who thought he could steal my child and use him as a simple bargaining chip to save his ruined life. The bright red dot on my screen finally came to a complete stop, lingering over a highly exclusive luxury residential high-rise located right in the center of the wealthy Midtown financial district. Darius pulled his sedan sharply into the loading zone of the towering glass building, slamming the car into park and throwing on his hazard lights before we both stepped out onto the busy city sidewalk. I looked up at the towering modern structure, knowing exactly what kind of expensive corporate penthouse Desmond was using as his secret sanctuary, while his family company burned to the absolute ground under his utterly incompetent leadership. I marched through the revolving glass doors of the lobby with Darius following right behind me, marching straight up to the expensive marble security desk, where a uniformed concierge tried to ask us for our specific names and resident access codes. I did not even slow my pace, slapping my senior corporate liquidator credentials directly onto the desk and informing him coldly that we were here. I demanded immediate, unrestricted access to the penthouse elevator, stating that we were executing a federal asset retrieval on a defaulted executive account, which made the concierge take one terrified look at Darius, who flashed his gleaming federal court badge and immediately hit the override button, granting us total access without asking a single follow-up question. We stepped into the plush velvet-lined elevator car, and I pressed the button for the top floor, watching the digital numbers climb higher and higher above the city skyline, while the heavy silence between me and my attorney spoke volumes about the violence of the impending confrontation. I pulled my primary phone back out of my coat pocket, swiping the screen to open the video recording application making. Absolutely sure the camera lens was perfectly clean and the microphone was properly calibrated to capture every single pathetic word that was about to be spoken. The elevator dinged softly as it reached the penthouse level, and the polished steel doors slid open silently, revealing a long, quiet hallway lined with expensive modern art and custom hardwood flooring, leading straight to the massive double doors of Desmond's secret luxury hideaway. I walked down the hallway, my designer boots making no sound on the thick, expensive runner rugs, gripping my phone tightly in my right hand, preparing to deliver the ultimate fatal blow to my husband, carefully constructed double life. I did not bother knocking on the heavy mahogany door or ringing the decorative brass bell. Because I was not a polite guest dropping by for a simple visit, I was a mother executing a tactical strike against a hostile threat. I lifted my leg and delivered a massive violent kick directly next to the digital locking mechanism, putting every ounce of my physical strength and built-up fury into the strike, shattering the expensive door frame and sending the heavy wood flying inward with a deafening explosive crash. I marched straight into the luxurious modern penthouse, holding my phone up high to record the entire scene unfolding before me, capturing the absolute perfect evidence for an ironclad at fault divorce that no corrupt judge could ever deny. The spacious living room was a massive mess of expensive takeout containers and empty champagne bottles. But my eyes locked immediately on my sweet son Leo, who was sitting very quietly there indeed. Leo was sitting on an expensive leather sofa, clutching his small backpack, and crying softly in obvious deep emotional distress, while Desmond was standing near the kitchen island, wearing a panicked, terrified expression, dropping a glass of water that shattered across the floor. What truly completed the horrific picture was the person standing directly beside him in the center of the room, looking absolutely horrified by the shattered door and my sudden violent appearance. She was a young white woman wearing expensive designer maternity clothes, holding her prominently pregnant belly, with shaking hands, revealing she was easily 6 months along. I kept my phone camera panning smoothly between Desmond's terrified face, the pregnant white mistress, and my crying son, ensuring every single detail of this disgusting betrayal was captured in high-definition video with crystal-clear audio. Desmond stammered, stepping away from his pregnant mistress, holding his hands up defensively as he tried to formulate a pathetic excuse, claiming this was all a massive misunderstanding and that he was just seeking a safe place for Leo, away from the stress of the foreclosure. I ignored his pathetic lies completely and walked straight past him, keeping the camera rolling as I knelt down next to the leather sofa, pulling Leo into a tight protective armed embrace, whispering softly that Mommy was here and everything was going to be perfectly fine now. The pregnant mistress backed away against the kitchen counters, tears streaming down her pale face, asking Desmond who I was and what was happening. Clearly panicking as the reality of her ruined secret life crashed down around her in the luxurious penthouse. I stood back up, keeping the camera focused squarely on Desmond, explaining to the weeping mistress that I was his legal wife, the mother of his child, and the corporate liquidator who just successfully seized every single asset his family owned, leaving him completely bankrupt and entirely worthless. Desmond screamed at me to stop recording, lunging forward in a desperate attempt to grab my phone, but Darius stepped smoothly into his path, shoving Desmond backward with a hard professional push, warning him that assaulting a woman in front of a federal attorney would result in immediate jail time without bail. Desmond stumbled backward, tripping over a velvet ottoman and crashing onto the hardwood floor, looking absolutely pathetic as he scrambled to regain his balance while his pregnant mistress continued to sob uncontrollably against the expensive marble countertops, realizing the wealthy man she thought she had secured was completely broke. I told Desmond that this video was going straight to the family court judge, showing exactly why his prenuptial agreement was entirely void, and proving he was an unfit, adulterous father who exposed his special needs son to his pregnant secret mistress during a hostile kidnapping attempt. Just as Desmond opened his mouth to scream another pathetic, useless threat, the shattered front doors of the penthouse were pushed open even wider, and another unexpected player burst into the chaotic scene, breathing heavily and looking completely deranged. Trent Sterling, my arrogant white brother-in-law, who had fled the Buckhead mansion earlier that morning, stormed into the penthouse apartment, his expensive suit rumpled and his face red with desperate exertion, completely unaware of the absolute disaster he was walking into. Trent ignored me and Darius, entirely rushing straight toward Desmond on the floor, screaming at him to hand over the Cayman Islands financial files and the offshore banking ledgers immediately, so he could hide the evidence of his massive gambling debts before the feds raided his hedge fund offices. Desmond looked up at Trent in pure confusion, asking how Trent even knew about this secret midtown apartment and why he was bursting in demanding files when the entire family empire was currently burning to the ground thanks to my hostile corporate takeover. Trent started to scream another demand, but his voice suddenly caught in his throat as his pale blue eyes shifted past Desmond and landed directly on the pregnant white mistress, cowering against the kitchen island, causing all the color to completely drain from his arrogant face in an instant. Trent staggered backward, pointing a shaking finger at the pregnant woman, his mouth opening and closing in absolute stunned disbelief, as the most twisted, sick realization of the entire morning finally came to light right in front of my rolling camera lens, confirming every single deeply rooted, horrible suspicion I ever had. I walked out of the shattered remains of the Midtown penthouse, holding my sweet son Leo tightly against my chest, as the sounds of Trent and Desmond violently tearing each other apart echoed down the expensive luxury hallway. Darius followed closely behind me, keeping a watchful eye on our surroundings to ensure no one attempted to follow us out of the building. We stepped into the plush elevator, and the heavy steel doors slid shut completely, cutting off the pathetic screams of the men who thought they could use my child as a simple bargaining chip in their failing corporate war. Leo buried his small face into the collar of my heavy winter coat, his tiny hands gripping my fabric with desperate strength as he silently processed the terrifying chaos he had just been forced to witness. I kissed the top of his head, whispering soft reassurances that he was completely safe now, and that Mommy would never let anyone hurt him or take him away ever again. Darius remained perfectly quiet during the rapid descent, allowing me the crucial space to comfort my son, while his sharp legal mind was undoubtedly already calculating our next tactical maneuver. We moved quickly through the elegant lobby, ignoring the terrified stares of the building staff, and rushed directly into the waiting black sedan parked by the curb. Darius slammed his foot on the accelerator, steering us rapidly away from the Midtown district and heading straight toward the highly secure luxury hotel where we had previously booked a private suite. The drive was tense but incredibly silent, offering a brief, fleeting moment of peace after the explosive confrontations of the morning. I kept my arms wrapped securely around Leo, rocking him gently until his tense little body finally relaxed against mine, and his breathing slowed into a steady, calming rhythm. I knew the war was far from over because Beatrice Pierce was a vicious, cornered animal who would use every single dirty trick to try and destroy me before I could finalize the absolute financial ruin of her precious century-old legacy. I just did not realize exactly how quickly she would strike back, or how impossibly low she was willing to sink to protect her fading empire. Darius pulled the heavy sedan into the private underground parking garage of the secure luxury hotel, cutting the engine and turning to look at me with a deeply serious expression. He advised me to go straight up to the suite and lock the doors, while he made some calls to federal judges to ensure Desmond would face immediate severe legal consequences for his desperate kidnapping attempt. I thanked him sincerely for his unwavering support and stepped out of the vehicle carrying my exhausted son, who had fallen into a deep, comforting sleep against my shoulder. I walked through the sliding glass doors into the grand marble lobby of the hotel, fully expecting to grab my room key from the private concierge and simply disappear into the safety of our suite for the rest of the cold winter afternoon. Instead, my heart stopped completely dead in my chest as I took in the horrifying scene waiting for me right in the middle of the elegant hotel lobby. Standing directly in front of the reception desk were two armed Atlanta police officers, looking tense and highly alert. Standing between the uniformed officers was a stern-looking white woman wearing a cheap gray pantsuit and holding a thick manila clipboard, her face pulled into a tight, severe expression of ultimate bureaucratic authority. The moment the glass doors slid shut behind me, The woman's head snapped in my direction, her eyes locking onto me and my sleeping child with absolute terrifying purpose. She marched straight toward me with the two armed officers following closely behind her, forming a solid human wall that completely blocked my path to the guest elevators. She held up her official badge, demanding to know if I was Naomi Pierce, and stating in a loud, aggressive voice that she was an emergency investigator with Child Protective Services. The few wealthy hotel guests lingering in the lobby immediately stopped talking and turned to stare at us, their eyes wide with morbid curiosity. The investigator coldly informed me that her agency had received a highly credible emergency report stating that I was currently suffering from a severe, dangerous episode of postpartum psychosis. She continued reading from her card, claiming the report detailed my supposedly violent, erratic behavior that morning and kidnapping a vulnerable special needs child while experiencing a complete psychological break from reality. She stated clearly that based on the severity of these high-profile accusations, she had full legal authority to immediately remove Leo from my custody and place him into emergency temporary foster care, while a mandatory psychiatric evaluation was conducted on me. The sheer unadulterated evil of the attack actually took my breath away for a fleeting fraction of a second. Beatrice Pierce, having miraculously and completely recovered from her incredibly fake heart attack at the Buckhead mansion, had used her old money connections to weaponize the child welfare system against me. She knew she could not beat me in a boardroom, and she knew her corrupt local police officers were absolutely useless against my federal attorneys, so she decided to strike at the only thing in the entire world that actually mattered to me. She was trying to steal my son, using the very system designed to protect vulnerable children, turning it into a vicious tool of upper-class revenge, to break my spirit and force me to surrender the corporate empire I had just rightfully conquered. The Child Protective Services investigator stepped closer, reaching her hands out as if she expected me to simply hand over my sleeping child without a single fight. The two armed police officers rested their hands on their duty belts, preparing to use physical force if I dared to resist the emergency removal order. Any normal mother would have collapsed into a puddle of hysterical tears, begging and pleading with the officers not to take her baby, screaming about the injustice of the false accusations, and ultimately making herself look exactly like the deranged psychotic woman Beatrice had falsely described. But I was not a normal mother, and I was absolutely done playing defense against a family of desperate, pathetic criminals. I held Leo tighter against my chest, ensuring he stayed safely asleep, and looked the investigator directly in her eyes, keeping my face completely devoid of any emotion whatsoever. I kept my voice impossibly calm and perfectly level as I instructed the investigator to step back and lower her hands immediately because nobody was taking my son anywhere today. The investigator scoffed, looking offended by my absolute refusal to cower before her authority, telling me that I did not have a choice and that resisting an emergency protective order would only result in my immediate violent arrest. I smiled a cold, dead smile that caused the investigator to falter just slightly in her aggressive stance. I politely suggested that before she made the monumental career-ending mistake of trying to physically separate a federal corporate liquidator from her child, she might just want to take a seat with me in the private hotel lounge so we could have a very brief, very enlightening conversation about her personal finances. The investigator narrowed her eyes suspiciously, looking back at the two police officers, who seemed equally confused by my absolute total lack of panic. She hesitated for a moment, but the sheer unwavering confidence radiating from my posture clearly made her second-guess the narrative she had been fed by the wealthy Pierce family matriarch. She told the officers to wait on standby and reluctantly followed me into the quiet, empty luxury lounge adjacent to the main lobby, sitting down rigidly on the edge of a velvet armchair while keeping her clipboard clutched tightly to her chest. I sat down across from her, keeping Leo safely nestled in my lap, and carefully pulled my secure secondary mobile device from my deep coat pocket. I unlocked the encrypted screen and pulled up a highly sensitive banking document that my forensic accounting team had intercepted just an hour ago while monitoring the remaining Pierce family subsidiary accounts. I turned the bright screen around and slid the phone across the low glass coffee table, pushing it directly into the investigator line of sight. I told her she had exactly 10 seconds to explain to me and the federal government why Beatrice Pierce authorized a highly classified wire transfer of exactly $50,000 from a hidden corporate holding account directly into a small, struggling commercial bakery business located in downtown Atlanta late yesterday afternoon. The investigator stared at the digital document, her eyes scanning the routing numbers and the specific business names listed on the wire transfer receipt. Slowly, all the color completely drained from her stern face, leaving her looking pale, sickly, and absolutely terrified as the devastating reality of her massive mistake crashed down upon her. I continued speaking, my voice dropping to a lethal quiet whisper as I explained that my corporate intelligence team knew that specific failing bakery was owned and operated entirely by the investigator biological sister who had been facing imminent bankruptcy and total foreclosure until a miraculous anonymous wealthy benefactor decided to save her business just in time for the holidays. I leaned forward slightly, ensuring my eyes bored directly into her soul, asking her if she really thought a ruthless financial predator like me would not immediately track every single dirty penny flowing out of the Pierce family accounts during a hostile takeover. I tapped my manicured finger once against the glass table, demanding she explain why she accepted a massive illegal bribe from Beatrice Pierce to falsely target a loving mother and attempt to traumatize an innocent child just to help a desperate old woman settle a personal vendetta. I informed the trembling investigator that I had a drafted email sitting in my outbox containing all the unarguable digital proof of this disgusting financial transaction, completely ready to be sent directly to the Federal Inspector General, the State Licensing Board, and the local news networks. The investigator began to shake, her bureaucratic arrogance completely destroyed by the terrifying threat of professional and criminal ruin. She stammered, tears welling in her panicked eyes as she repeatedly apologized, begging me not to send the email and promising she would close the emergency case file and delete the false psychological report from the state system. I stared at her, ordering her to take her corrupt police officers and walk out of my hotel before I changed my mind and sent her to federal prison. The woman grabbed her clipboard and sprinted out of the luxury lounge, waving off the confused armed officers and rushing blindly through the glass doors without ever looking back. I finally let out a long, shaky breath, wrapping both my arms tightly around my sweet sleeping son, feeling an overwhelming rush of protective maternal love. I carried Leo up to our secure penthouse suite, locking the heavy doors behind us, and finally allowing myself to rest after the most exhausting, brutal day of my life. However, when I woke up the next morning and turned on the large flat-screen television in the suite, my temporary sense of peace was instantly shattered into a million jagged pieces. Every local news station was running a breaking story with my face plastered across the screen and the headline, "Gold-Digging Wife Destroys Century-Old Atlanta Legacy Family." Beatrice Pierce realized she could not beat me with the police or corrupt child services, so she launched a public relations war to destroy my reputation, and I knew the battle was only just beginning. The horrifying news broadcast continued to play on the large flat-screen television in my hotel suite, painting me as a vicious, calculating gold digger who had maliciously infiltrated and destroyed one of the most prominent wealthy black families in Atlanta. Beatrice Pierce had clearly called every single media contact and high society connection in her extensive address book, spinning a massive web of devastating lies, portraying herself as the helpless elderly victim of a cruel corporate predator. My secure mobile phone began to ring endlessly as the morning progressed, with dozens of panicked notifications flooding my screen from my top-tier corporate clients who were absolutely terrified of being associated with such a massive public scandal. Several major business partners nervously requested immediate meetings to reconsider our multi-million-dollar restructuring contracts, stating that the optics of working with a woman accused of destroying a century-old legacy family were simply too toxic for their corporate image. Darius sat across from me in the luxury hotel lounge, his sharp legal mind working rapidly as he monitored the escalating public relations disaster, suggesting we immediately file defamation lawsuits and issue a strongly worded press release to counter her vicious narrative. I simply shook my head and told him that fighting Beatrice in the press would only validate her pathetic lies. and give her exactly the kind of prolonged media attention she desperately craved to maintain her fragile social status. I knew that old money families like the Pierces relied entirely on public perception and community standing to survive, so the only way to truly defeat them was to completely obliterate that fake image, right in front of the very people they were desperately trying to impress. Darius pulled up a digital invitation that had just been blasted across every elite social circle in the city, revealing that Beatrice and Desmond were hosting a lavish Black Excellence charity gala at the most exclusive country club in Buckhead that very evening. The invitation shamelessly pleaded for the community to come together and donate massive funds to help save their historic family legacy from the vicious greed of a hostile corporate takeover, deliberately using their race and historical standing to manipulate the wealthy attendees into opening their checkbooks. They were actively trying to scam the absolute wealthiest people in Atlanta to fund their legal defense and maintain their luxurious lifestyle while pretending to be noble victims of a ruthless attack. I knew that this level of deep-seated societal manipulation was exactly how they had operated for their entire lives, feeding off the good on the very same working-class individuals they now claimed to champion and protect. They were banking entirely on the false hope that I would be too intimidated by their vast network of powerful friends to ever show my face in public again, assuming I would simply hide away in shame and quietly disappear into the background, leaving them to completely rewrite history exactly as they saw fit. I smiled a cold, calculating smile, knowing this arrogant charity gala was the absolute perfect opportunity to deliver a fatal public execution to their carefully constructed empire of lies. I told Darius I did not want to issue a press release or hide behind legal statements because I was going to attend that extravagant gala in person and burn their fake Black excellence narrative to the ground right in front of their wealthy peers. Darius immediately understood my tactical strategy and began making highly classified phone calls while I focused on executing the technical aspects of my impending corporate and social revenge. I contacted a silent holding company. I controlled and instructed my financial team to aggressively and immediately purchase a majority controlling stake in the premier audio-visual production company that the country club had contracted to manage the lighting screens and sound systems for the evening gala. Within 3 hours, I officially owned the entire production company and immediately issued strict confidential directives to the lead technicians working the event, ensuring my specific digital files were secretly loaded into the main broadcasting servers without a single member of the Pierce family ever knowing what was truly about to hit them with such devastating force tonight. While the technical trap was being set perfectly in place, I hired an exclusive private stylist to bring a selection of stunning designer gowns directly to my hotel suite because I refused to walk into that country club looking like the defeated, stressed-out victim they desperately wanted me to be. I selected a breathtaking floor-length emerald green gown that fit my body with absolute flawless precision, pairing it with simple, elegant diamond jewelry that radiated quiet, authentic power rather than desperate, flashy new money desperation. I arranged for a trusted private nanny to stay in the secure hotel suite with Leo, ensuring he was completely safe and deeply entertained with his favorite movies and toys, completely shielded from the monumental social slaughter I was about to unleash upon his toxic paternal family. The evening air was crisp and cold, as my rented black luxury town car pulled smoothly up to the grand entrance of the heavily guarded Buckhead Country Club. I stepped out of the vehicle projecting absolute unwavering confidence, while valet attendants and security guards rushed to open the heavy glass doors completely unaware that they were letting the ultimate apex predator directly into the heart of the prestigious event. The massive ballroom was decorated with nauseating levels of excessive opulence, featuring towering floral arrangements, expensive crystal centerpieces, and massive digital LED screens, projecting the Pierce family crest in brilliant gold lettering, meant to remind everyone of their profound historical importance. The room was absolutely packed with the most influential, wealthy, and powerful figures in Atlanta's society, all dressed in their finest formal wear, murmuring sympathetically about the tragic misfortune that had befallen the noble Pierce family. I glided seamlessly into the crowded room, keeping to the dimly lit periphery and accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter watching the sickening theatrical performance unfolding near the center of the ballroom. Beatrice was wearing a somber but incredibly expensive black gown, clutching a lace handkerchief and dabbing at her dry eyes, while accepting hugs and condolences from gullible local politicians and wealthy real estate developers. Desmond stood faithfully by her side, wearing a tailored tuxedo, looking appropriately mournful and brave, completely playing the role of the devoted son, fighting to protect his family. Honor from a deranged, greedy monster who wanted nothing more than to see them all suffer endlessly for her own twisted personal gain and sadistic amusement. Camille was working the other side of the room, holding a martini glass and whispering dramatic, exaggerated stories about my supposed cruelty to anyone who would listen, soaking up the sympathetic attention like a dying plant, absorbing water, while Trent stood awkwardly near the bar, trying to look completely unbothered by the massive stress slowly consuming him from the inside out. I watched them successfully manipulate hundreds of incredibly smart, wealthy people using their polished charm and decades of established social capital to extract massive charitable donations that would actually just go straight into their heavily depleted personal bank accounts under the guise of a highly noble legal defense trust. The sheer audacity of their public scam was almost impressive, but it only fueled the burning cold fire in my chest, confirming that completely destroying them was not just a personal necessity, but a profound, deeply required public service to the entire city. The soft, elegant background music suddenly faded away, and the bright ballroom lights dimmed as Desmond slowly walked up the steps to the main stage, standing behind a crystal podium, while the massive lead screens behind him shifted to display a beautifully edited slideshow of historic Pierce family photographs, showcasing generations of carefully cultivated false perfection. The entire ballroom fell into a respectful, hushed silence as Desmond gripped the edges of the podium, looking out at the wealthy crowd with a perfectly practiced expression of deep emotional burden and deeply noble resilience. He leaned into the microphone, and his voice echoed across the massive room, carrying a trembling, pathetic tone as he thanked everyone for coming together to support his family during this incredibly dark and painful chapter of their lives. He began spinning a beautiful emotional lie, talking about how his ancestors had built the Pierce legacy through blood, sweat, and unyielding determination, establishing a pillar of Black excellence that had supported the community for well over a century. Desmond squeezed his eyes shut, squeezing out a single fake crocodile tear as he lamented how a vicious, calculating woman he had foolishly trusted and married was now trying to tear down everything his family had built out of pure malicious greed and deep sociopathic jealousy. The wealthy guests murmured in absolute collective sympathy, some even shaking their heads in disgust at my supposed cruelty, completely buying into the emotional manipulation being served to them on a silver platter. Desmond raised his hand dramatically, preparing to ask the elite crowd to open their checkbooks and generously donate to their legal defense fund to help them fight the evil corporate predator who had stolen their home. But just as he opened his mouth to deliver the final pathetic plea for money, the towering LED screens behind him suddenly flickered violently, glitching with a loud, sharp burst of electronic static that made the entire crowd jump in sheer surprise. The beautiful historic family photos instantly vanished from the massive screens, replaced by stark high-definition images of highly classified offshore bank statements and detailed commercial wire transfer receipts. Desmond froze completely, his mouth hanging open in sheer confusion as the wealthy crowd began to gasp and point at the enormous glowing numbers displayed brightly behind him, clearly showing millions of dollars being illegally funneled into hidden shell companies in the Cayman Islands, bearing his exact electronic signature. Before Desmond could even turn around to see what was happening, the audio system crackled to life, broadcasting a crystal-clear high-definition recording of Trent's arrogant voice, echoing violently through the elegant country club ballroom. The voice recording played loudly for every single guest to hear, capturing Trent explicitly bragging about planting his former assistant in Desmond's bed to steal corporate trade secrets, and mocking Desmond for being an incredibly stupid, gullible puppet who had completely ruined his own company beyond repair. Desmond's face drained of all color, turning an absolute sickly shade of pale gray as he finally turned around and stared at the towering screens, realizing his deepest, darkest financial crimes and personal humiliations were being broadcast live to the powerful crowd. The ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked gasps, angry murmurs, and sudden furious shouting as the wealthy elite realized the noble victim on stage was actually a pathetic, incompetent criminal trying to scam them. But the digital slaughter was not remotely finished, because the screens flickered again, dropping the financial documents, replacing them with a stark black screen as a new audio file played through the speakers. It was the unmistakable aristocratic voice of Beatrice Pierce, recorded secretly by a former employee, explicitly calling the exact same gala guests standing in the room gullible new money trash, claiming they were walking checkbooks. The reaction was instantaneous as the donors transformed into an insulted mob. Beatrice stood frozen, watching her century-old empire disintegrate. Suddenly, the heavy ornate double doors of the country club ballroom burst open, instantly silencing the furious guests as armed men in dark windbreakers stormed inside. Their jackets were prominently emblazoned with the bright bold yellow letters of the IRS and the FBI moving with strict military precision. The agents did not march toward Trent, cowering near the bar. Instead, they moved directly and purposefully straight toward Beatrice Pierce. Exactly now. The heavy silence in the elegant ballroom was instantly shattered by the sharp metallic clink of federal handcuffs being aggressively secured around the wrists of Beatrice Pierce, who stood completely frozen in absolute shock as the reality of her total destruction finally registered in her arrogant mind. The incredibly wealthy guests, who had been ready to write massive donation checks just moments ago, began backing away in sheer terror, realizing the distinguished matriarch of the Pierce family was nothing more than a common criminal being publicly humiliated and arrested by the Federal Bureau of Investigation right in front of them. Beatrice tried to maintain her aristocratic dignity, demanding the agents unhand her, immediately claiming this was a massive misunderstanding and threatening to call the governor of Georgia to have them all fired. But the lead agent simply ignored her pathetic threats, informing her coldly that she was being charged with massive tax evasion and severe wire fraud. Trent was apprehended near the open bar, his face pale and sweating profusely as an agent shoved him against the mahogany counter, searching his tailored suit for hidden weapons while reading him his federal rights, drowning out the elegant background music almost entirely. Desmond watched his mother and his brother-in-law being forcefully dragged out of the country club, screaming and cursing at the agents, leaving him completely exposed on the grand stage under the glaring spotlight of his own ruined charity gala. The remaining high society attendees immediately began recording the spectacular downfall on their expensive smartphones, documenting every single pathetic second of the Pierce family, losing their century-old legacy in real time, while I stood quietly in the shadows holding my glass of champagne, savoring the incredibly sweet taste of absolute victory washing over my entire soul right now. The next morning, the media coverage was absolutely merciless, broadcasting the humiliating arrest footage across every local and national news network, completely destroying the fake Black excellence narrative Beatrice had spent decades carefully cultivating to hide her profound corruption. I drove to the federal holding facility in downtown Atlanta alongside my brilliant attorney Darius, who had arranged for us to observe the ongoing interrogations through the secure viewing rooms, heavily protected by attorney-client privileges and federal cooperation agreements, giving me a front-row seat to the final pathetic chapter of my husband's completely useless corporate career happening right today. Inside the stark gray interrogation room, Desmond was pacing back and forth like a trapped, terrified animal, sweating through his expensive designer clothing and rambling incoherently to the two stone-faced federal prosecutors sitting across from him at the metal table. Desmond had not even been formally arrested yet, because the federal agents wanted to see if he would voluntarily hang himself with his own profound cowardice, and he was performing exactly as I knew he would, desperately trying to trade his own family members for a taste of total legal immunity to save his own miserable skin right now. Desmond slammed his hands down on the metal table, leaning forward and screaming that he had the master financial ledgers, begging the federal agents to give him a full immunity deal in exchange for testifying against his mother and his brother-in-law. He told the agents that Beatrice and Trent were the true masterminds behind the entire fraudulent operation, claiming they had manipulated him and used his position as the holding company chief executive officer to launder millions of dollars through offshore accounts, while he was just an innocent bystander who knew absolutely nothing about their criminal activities today. It was incredibly pathetic to watch a grown man who had spent his entire life bragging about his massive corporate intellect and his superior old money bloodline, suddenly crying like a helpless child offering to send his own mother to federal prison for the rest of her natural life, just so he could walk free. The federal prosecutors simply watched him in dead silence, allowing him to incriminate himself further with every single desperate word falling from his trembling lips, completely unaware that the real architect of his absolute destruction was watching him through the thick two-way glass mirror. I turned to the senior federal prosecutor standing beside me in the dark viewing room, nodding my head once to signal that it was finally time to deliver the ultimate fatal blow to Desmond's pathetic illusions of freedom and safety. The prosecutor opened the heavy metal door and stepped into the interrogation room, leaving the door propped open just enough so Desmond could see my face staring back at him from the shadows, causing his desperate rambling to stop instantly as his bloodshot eyes locked onto mine, feeling the absolute cold terror gripping his chest in this exact moment today. I walked slowly into the harsh fluorescent light of the interrogation room, my designer heels echoing loudly against the cold concrete floor, sliding a thick stack of heavily verified corporate banking documents directly across the metal table toward my sweating, terrified husband. I looked down at him with an expression of pure clinical detachment, informing him softly that he could not testify against his mother or his brother-in-law today, tomorrow, or ever, because he had absolutely no leverage to negotiate any kind of immunity deal with the United States federal government at all right now in this room. Desmond stared at me in total confusion, asking what I meant, and claiming he was the only one who could decode the offshore shell companies to prove Beatrice was guilty of massive tax evasion and severe wire fraud over the past decade. I tapped my manicured finger against the top page of the corporate documents, instructing him to look very closely at the signature lines on every single illegal wire transfer, every fraudulent loan application, and every offshore banking ledger that had been meticulously processed through the Cayman Islands shell companies during his entirely disastrous tenure as chief executive today. Desmond's hands shook violently as he flipped through the thick stack of papers, his eyes scanning the endless rows of complex financial data before finally landing on the official signature lines located at the bottom of every single highly illegal federal document. All the color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost, as the devastating reality of his entire existence completely crushed his fragile, arrogant mind. Realizing every single signature, authorizing the massive corporate fraud, belonged entirely and exclusively to him, making him the only legally responsible party for the entire criminal enterprise today. "You are the sole signatory on the shell companies, Desmond," I whispered, my voice cut through the silent interrogation room, like a freshly sharpened knife tearing through paper. Confirming his absolute worst nightmare was actually a completely inescapable physical reality today. "Beatrice did not make you the chief executive officer of the family empire out of love or respect for your business acumen. She set you up as the perfect, oblivious legal fall guy years ago, deliberately isolating herself from the paper trail, so you would take the federal prison sentence when the entire corrupt system finally collapsed completely forever." The sound that escaped Desmond's throat was a pathetic, hollow gasp as his entire world utterly shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces, recognizing that the mother he had spent his life trying to please had intentionally engineered his total destruction just to protect her own wealth. He dropped the documents and fell back into his metal chair, staring blankly at the concrete wall, his mind completely broken by the profound betrayal of his own mother, realizing he was looking at decades in a federal penitentiary, while the woman who raised him had planned to walk away entirely clean right now. I turned my back on my ruined husband, without an ounce of pity or regret, walking out of the interrogation room alongside the federal prosecutors, knowing Desmond would soon be formally processed and locked in a small concrete cell for the foreseeable future. As I exited the heavily guarded federal building and stepped out into the crisp Atlanta afternoon air, I found someone waiting for me near the bottom of the concrete steps, looking absolutely desperate and completely stripped of all the arrogant high society pride she had worn like a heavy crown for her entire worthless life until today. It was Camille, my entitled delusional sister-in-law, who had somehow managed to completely avoid federal arrest because she was too stupid and entirely useless to be trusted with signing any actual corporate documents during her massive fraudulent reign over the city. Camille was wearing dark oversized sunglasses and a simple coat, pacing nervously on the sidewalk, but the moment she saw me walking down the steps, she rushed forward, moving with a frantic, pathetic energy that was incredibly satisfying to witness. After 5 years of enduring her endless cruel remarks about my natural hair and background today, she practically fell to her knees right there on the dirty city sidewalk, ignoring the curious stares of passing pedestrians, grabbing the edge of my designer coat, and begging me with thick, messy tears streaming down her carefully contoured face to show her some mercy. "Naomi, please!" She sobbed, her voice cracking with sheer desperation, begging me not to take her luxury condo or her expensive white Mercedes-Benz, pleading that she had absolutely nothing to do with the offshore accounts or the fake heart attacks, and that she was just an innocent victim of her mother's dark manipulation today. I stared down at the pathetic woman who had spent years making sure I felt like an unwanted ghetto outsider at every single family dinner, laughing when Desmond belittled me and mocking my sweet son Leo for his speech delay without a single ounce of empathy. Seeing her groveling at my feet, begging to keep her superficial luxury items, while her husband and mother sat in federal holding cells, and her brother faced decades in prison, filled me with an incredibly profound sense of absolute poetic justice. Knowing the universe was finally balancing the scales very perfectly and beautifully today. I reached down and gently pulled my coat from her frantic, grasping hands, telling her in a calm, soothing voice that I was not a monster, and I would gladly allow her to keep her precious white Mercedes-Benz and her current bank accounts completely untouched. Camille let out a massive gasp of profound relief, thanking me repeatedly and promising she would never say another bad word about me or my son ever again, completely believing she had somehow managed to survive the absolute destruction of her family empire by simply begging for forgiveness on a public sidewalk exactly today. But my mercy always comes with a steep price. I continued, my voice dropping into that familiar lethal tone, causing her sudden smile to vanish instantly as I explained the one single devastating condition she had to accept if she wanted to keep her superficial wealth. I told her she could keep the car and the money, but she had to immediately accept a full-time minimum wage job working as a front desk receptionist at the exact same exclusive Buckhead Country Club where she had spent her entire adult life acting like royalty and treating staff like trash today. I informed her that my private equity firm had just purchased a controlling stake in the country club operations, meaning she would be working directly for me, and if she ever quit or was fired for treating a single person with disrespect, I would immediately seize everything she owned, leaving her completely homeless and destitute. Camille stared at me in total, absolute horror, realizing I was intentionally stripping away her entire social standing, forcing her to serve the very elite peers she used to rule over, ensuring her daily existence would be a permanent, humiliating reminder of her ultimate defeat. 3 months had passed since the spectacular, highly public destruction of the Pierce family empire and the subsequent federal arrests that permanently and completely shattered their fake aristocratic legacy forever. The bitter cold of the Atlanta winter had slowly melted away into a humid, heavy spring. But the relentless, brutal war for my ultimate total freedom was absolutely far from being over yet. Today we were entering the final, most crucial and terrifying battleground of them all, the Fulton County Family Court, where the legal and physical fate of my sweet son Leo would be officially decided once and for all. I walked up the massive stone steps of the imposing courthouse, holding Leo tightly by his small, warm hand, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my expression completely devoid of any fear or intimidation whatsoever. Leo was wearing a handsome little navy blue suit, looking around at the towering marble pillars with wide, curious brown eyes, clutching his small favorite backpack closely to his chest. Darius walked confidently right beside us, carrying his heavy leather briefcase packed tightly with every single piece of devastating evidence we needed to completely annihilate my soon-to-be ex-husband in front of the judge today. We stepped through the heavy metal security doors and made our way down the long, bustling, echoing corridor toward the assigned courtroom, where the absolute final nail in the Pierce family coffin would finally be driven deep. Desmond was already sitting at the respondent table inside the dark wood-paneled courtroom, looking completely different from the arrogant, wealthy chief executive officer who had tried to physically intimidate me just 3 short months ago. His expensive tailored designer suits had been replaced by a cheap, ill-fitting gray jacket, and his face was gaunt, hollow, and covered in a thick layer of nervous, glistening sweat. He was currently out on a highly restrictive federal bail, awaiting his inevitable criminal trial for massive corporate fraud and severe tax evasion. But he was still desperately clinging to the very last pathetic scrap of power he thought he had left in this world, which was the legal custody of our innocent child. Sitting directly next to Desmond was his newly hired defense attorney, a notoriously sleazy bottom-feeding lawyer named Malcolm Green, who was infamous throughout the entire city of Atlanta for utilizing incredibly dirty, underhanded illegal tactics to win family court cases for desperate, ruined, guilty men. Malcolm leaned over and whispered something into Desmond, causing Desmond to look up and shoot me a sickeningly confident, arrogant smirk that made my stomach churn with pure absolute disgust and deep maternal rage. I guided Leo to the small seating area reserved for children outside the immediate legal circle, ensuring he was perfectly comfortable with his favorite coloring books and his trusted private nanny before taking my seat next to Darius at the polished petitioner table. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open loudly, and Judge Theodore Vance walked into the courtroom, his black robes billowing slightly as he took his seat high above us all. Judge Vance was a notoriously old-school conservative man who had presided over Atlanta elite family disputes for over 3 decades, and more importantly, he was a man who used to frequently attend Beatrice Pierce's extravagant charity galas before her spectacular federal downfall. I knew immediately that getting a fair, objective hearing from a man who had spent years drinking expensive champagne with my corrupt mother-in-law was going to be an incredibly steep uphill battle today. Judge Vance banged his wooden gavel, once bringing the tense courtroom to absolute silence, before peering down over his reading glasses at the paperwork stacked neatly on his high desk. He cleared his throat and announced that we were here to determine the final dissolution of the marriage and the permanent custody arrangements for the minor child, Leo Pierce asking the defense to present their opening arguments. Malcolm Green stood up, adjusting his cheap tie, and launched into an incredibly disgusting theatrical performance painting Desmond as a devoted, loving father who had been tragically victimized by a ruthless, cold-hearted corporate wife. Malcolm loudly proclaimed that while his client was currently facing some unfortunate and completely unproven federal business complications, he remained a deeply committed family man who only wanted the absolute best for his special needs son. Darius scoffed quietly beside me, keeping his eyes locked fiercely on the opposing counsel as Malcolm paced dramatically across the courtroom floor, preparing to drop his massive fabricated legal bomb. Malcolm walked back to his table and picked up a thick bound document, holding it high in the air for the judge to see, claiming he was submitting a previously unfiled ironclad prenuptial agreement that dictated the precise, unalterable terms of this specific custody dispute. I frowned in deep confusion, looking quickly at Darius, because Desmond and I had never signed a prenuptial agreement before our wedding, since I had absolutely zero assets at the time, and his family had arrogantly assumed I would never dare to leave them. Darius stood up immediately, objecting loudly to the introduction of unverified surprise evidence, stating clearly that no such document existed in any official public family court record or previous legal filing anywhere in the entire state of Georgia. Judge Vance completely ignored Darius' valid legal objection, telling him to sit down and be quiet, while allowing Malcolm to approach the bench and hand over the highly questionable document directly to the court. Malcolm smiled his greasy, slimy smile, informing the judge that this specific prenuptial contract contained a highly specialized legacy clause legally drafted and signed by both parties exclusively to protect the historical lineage of the prestigious Pierce family. Malcolm read the completely fabricated clause out loud, his voice echoing through the silent room, stating that in the highly unfortunate event of a marital dissolution, the primary male heir, Leo Pierce, must remain in the sole primary custody of the paternal family to properly maintain their historical bloodline and elite social standing. The absolute sheer audacity of the forged document was incredibly breathtaking, completely attempting to bypass every single modern child welfare law by treating my sweet, innocent son like a piece of inherited antique property belonging exclusively to a ruined, corrupt dynasty. Malcolm continued his vicious targeted attack, explicitly portraying me as a deeply unfit, overly ambitious, overworked corporate drone who spent 18 hours a day liquidating vulnerable companies, completely neglecting my maternal duties, while Desmond supposedly stayed home dedicating his entire life to raising our child. Darius leaped to his feet, slamming his hands down on our table and tearing into the absolute pathetic legality of the fraudulent prenup, arguing passionately that the signature was a blatant digital forgery and that such an archaic, disgusting legacy clause was fundamentally unenforceable under any modern federal or state family law statute today. Darius eloquently pointed out that Desmond was a criminally indicted, unemployed fraudster who had previously attempted to violently kidnap the child and expose him to a secret pregnant mistress, making him objectively and entirely unfit to hold any form of custody whatsoever. I watched the judge face closely, hoping to see a glimmer of basic logical reason or standard, legal objectivity. But my heart sank completely into my stomach as I saw the old conservative man nodding slowly along with Malcolm, utterly ridiculous archaic arguments instead. Judge Vance looked down at me with an expression of deep-seated patriarchal disapproval. Clearly harboring immense personal resentment toward a young, successful black woman who had managed to completely dismantle a legacy family he deeply respected and admired for decades. The biased judge leaned forward, resting his hands on his desk, and stated that while the federal criminal allegations against Desmond were certainly unfortunate, they were strictly financial in nature and did not automatically negate his inherent fundamental rights as a loving biological father. Judge Vance continued his infuriating lecture, expressing severe, extreme concern regarding my highly demanding corporate career path, questioning loudly how a woman who single-handedly orchestrated massive hostile corporate takeovers could possibly have the adequate time, patience, or maternal softness required to properly raise a vulnerable special needs child alone. The biased judge then dropped an absolute devastating legal nightmare directly onto our table, hinting very strongly that he was heavily inclined to award Desmond full joint physical custody to ensure the boy maintained his historical family connection regardless of the pending federal criminal trials. Furthermore, Judge Vance added, his voice dripping with condescending judgment. He stated that since Desmond was currently unemployed due to the hostile total acquisition of his family company, and I was now the highly successful, wealthy owner of those exact same massive corporate assets, I would be legally required to pay Desmond an incredibly massive monthly spousal support stipend to ensure the father of my child could maintain his accustomed luxurious standard of living. The sheer, unadulterated evil of the situation washed over me like a suffocating wave of pure, ice-cold water. Realizing this corrupt, biased judge was actually going to force me to financially bankroll the very same pathetic abuser who had terrorized me for 5 years and tried to kidnap my son. Desmond let out a low, victorious chuckle, covering his mouth to hide his massive, smug smile, completely thrilled by the horrifying prospect of using the corrupt family court system to legally extract endless millions of dollars from my hard-earned business empire, while simultaneously using our child as a permanent emotional hostage. Darius began to argue fiercely, demanding an immediate recess and a formal forensic review of the forged prenuptial agreement. But Judge Vance held up his hand, demanding absolute silence in his courtroom, immediately threatening to hold my attorney in direct contempt if he spoke another word out of turn today. Judge Vance declared that he could not possibly make a final absolute ruling on the permanent custody arrangement or the financial support orders without first directly evaluating the current psychological well-being and personal familial preferences of the minor child involved in this highly complex case. The conservative judge ordered a completely private closed-door in chambers interview with 5-year-old Leo entirely isolated from both parents and all legal counsel to personally determine which parent the child truly felt most deeply connected to right now today. The entire courtroom fell incredibly dead silent as the horrifying gravity of the judge's ultimate ruling settled heavily over my terrified beating heart, knowing exactly what this specific evaluation truly meant for our future. Desmond turned his head slowly and looked directly at me, his eyes practically glowing with pure malicious dark triumph, shooting me a terrifyingly confident arrogant smirk that made my blood run completely cold in my veins. Desmond knew exactly what I knew, which was the devastating undeniable fact that Leo suffered from a severe, intense speech delay and extreme social anxiety, making him incredibly shy and completely nonverbal around loud, strange, intimidating adult men. Desmond was absolutely entirely certain that his deeply traumatized innocent little boy would freeze completely in terror inside those private chambers, rendering him completely unable to speak a single word or articulate any of the horrible abuse he had suffered, ensuring that this deeply biased judge would simply rule in favor of the legacy father by absolute default today, forever, right now, leaving me completely helpless to stop the horrific cycle of generational abuse from continuing onward and thoroughly crushing everything I had sacrificed to build. Desmond's arrogant grin grew even wider as the court bailiff approached the quiet seating area where my sweet boy was sitting innocently, completely unaware of the massive, terrifying weight resting heavily upon his small, fragile shoulders. He was entirely confident that his truly evil manipulation would definitively win him the absolute ultimate unassailable victory. The heavy wooden doors of the judge's private chambers loomed at the front of the silent courtroom, looking like the impenetrable gates of a fortified castle, ready to swallow my innocent child whole. The uniformed bailiff stepped forward with a surprisingly gentle demeanor, lowering his large hand to softly guide my sweet 5-year-old son away from his safe designated seating area. Leo clutched his small backpack tightly against his chest, his knuckles turning slightly white as he looked back at me over his tiny shoulder, his wide brown eyes searching my face for any sign of hidden danger. I forced myself to remain completely still, rooted to my chair at the petitioner table, projecting a mask of absolute unwavering calm and deep maternal confidence that I desperately hoped would transfer directly into his brave little heart today. I gave him a slow, reassuring nod, blinking back the hot tears that threatened to spill over my eyelashes, silently promising him that Mommy was right here and nobody would ever let the bad men hurt him again. Desmond immediately jumped up from the respondent table, adjusting his cheap gray suit jacket and pasting a sickeningly fake smile across his sweating face, eagerly following the bailiff and our son toward the dark mahogany doors. The doors clicked shut with a loud, heavy thud, separating me completely from my child and trapping him in a confined space with a biased conservative judge and the very monster who had spent years systematically destroying his fragile self-esteem. Darius placed his large, steady hand over mine on the polished wooden table, squeezing gently to anchor me in the terrifying silence of the tense courtroom, telling me in a low, soothing whisper that we had to trust the process now. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage as the minutes began to drag on with agonizing slowness, each tick of the large wall clock echoing like a judge gavel in my spinning mind. I closed my eyes and focused on breathing, trying to block out the sight of Malcolm Green packing his legal briefcase with an incredibly arrogant, confident swagger, fully believing his client had already secured the ultimate horrific victory. Inside the private chambers, the atmosphere was thick and oppressive, filled with the scent of old leather-bound law books and expensive wood polish. Judge Theodore Vance sat behind his massive mahogany desk, leaning back in his high leather chair, while the official court stenographer sat quietly in the corner, her fingers resting lightly on her machine, ready to record every single word spoken in the room. Desmond wasted absolutely no time, launching into his carefully rehearsed theatrical performance, dropping to one knee on the expensive Persian rug to put himself at eye level with Leo, projecting the false image of a deeply devoted and incredibly loving father. Desmond pulled a brightly colored lollipop from his jacket pocket, holding it out toward Leo, with a desperate smile, speaking in a sickeningly sweet baby voice that he had never once used during our entire disastrous marriage. He told Leo that Daddy missed him so much, and that Daddy had brought his favorite candy, hoping to buy the affection and silence of a child he had always viewed as a defective, embarrassing burden to his prestigious family legacy. Leo did not reach for the candy, and he did not smile back at the man kneeling in front of him. My brave little boy simply took a slow, deliberate step backward, his small sneakers pressing firmly into the thick rug, gripping his backpack even tighter against his chest as he stared at the colorful lollipop with profound, unblinking silence. Desmond let out a dramatic, heavy sigh, looking up at the judge with a perfectly crafted expression of tragic parental heartbreak, shaking his head slowly as if mourning a profound medical tragedy. He told Judge Vance that this was exactly what he and his lawyer had been trying to explain all morning, claiming that my demanding corporate career and my supposed emotional neglect had caused severe psychological damage to their son, resulting in a terrible, devastating speech delay. Desmond continued his vicious lies, stating that Leo was completely nonverbal in social situations because my aggressive ambition had deeply traumatized the boy, making him too shy and mentally stunted to even accept a simple piece of candy from his own loving father. Judge Vance nodded sympathetically, completely falling for the pathetic manipulation, seeing only a caring, wealthy father trying desperately to connect with a broken child who had been ruined by a cold, ruthless working mother. The conservative judge leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood desk, and looked down at Leo with a gentle but highly condescending gaze, clearly believing the boy lacked the basic mental capacity to understand complex adult conversations. Judge Vance asked Leo in a slow, exaggerated voice if he loved his daddy, and if he wanted to go live in a big house with his daddy and his grandmother, where they could take proper care of him every day. Desmond smirked triumphantly, remaining on one knee, fully expecting his son to freeze in absolute terror and remain completely silent, validating the entire fraudulent narrative they had built to steal my custody and secure a massive lifetime alimony payout. But Desmond Pierce had made one massive, fatal miscalculation in his arrogant, completely delusional plan today. He had spent 5 years treating Leo like an invisible piece of broken furniture, assuming the boy could not understand the cruel things spoken around him, completely failing to realize that a silent child is often the most observant and deeply intelligent person in the entire room. Leo did not freeze and he did not cry. Instead, my magnificent 5-year-old son stood perfectly straight, squaring his small shoulders as he looked away from the pathetic man on the floor and fixed his brown eyes directly on the judge, sitting behind the massive desk. Leo slowly and deliberately unzipped the front pocket of his small backpack, reaching his tiny hand inside to retrieve a carefully folded piece of paper. He pulled out the crumpled, slightly torn red construction paper, holding it gently in his hands. It was the exact same handmade Christmas card from that freezing morning on the Buckhead estate porch, decorated with uneven silver glitter and a wobbly drawing of a green pine tree. But now it bore the ugly dark imprint of Desmond, expensive leather shoe right across the middle. Desmond saw the red paper and the arrogant smile instantly vanished from his sweating face, all the color draining from his cheeks, as the horrifying realization of his impending doom finally began to dawn on his slow, pathetic mind. Leo took one step closer to the judge's massive desk, holding the crumpled shoe-printed card out in front of him. Then my beautiful, brilliant son opened his mouth and spoke. He did not stutter, and he did not whisper. He spoke with perfect, crystal-clear articulation, his small voice ringing out with an absolute flawless clarity that completely shattered the heavy silence of the judge's private chambers. Leo looked Judge Vance dead in the eyes and stated clearly that he stepped on my card. Leo pointed a tiny, steady finger directly at Desmond on the floor, continuing his flawless, perfectly pronounced sentence, stating that he said Christmas was better without me and Mommy. Leo paused for a fraction of a second, his voice dropping into a tone of absolute, resolute certainty before delivering the final devastating blow, stating that I do not want to live with a man who thinks I am a mistake. The quiet clicking of the court stenographer machine, recording, Every perfectly articulated word sounded like rapid machine gun fire in the stunned, absolute silence of the room. Judge Vance sat completely frozen in his high leather chair, his mouth hanging slightly open as he stared in absolute profound shock at the 5-year-old boy who was supposedly severely mentally stunted and completely nonverbal. The judge's eyes darted from the articulate, confident child standing before him, down to the crumpled shoe-printed Christmas card, and then finally resting on the sweating, terrified face of Desmond Pierce, kneeling on the Persian rug. The absolute truth hit the judge like a physical blow as he finally realized the horrifying reality of the situation unfolding right in front of his eyes today. There was absolutely no genetic speech delay, and there was no mental defect whatsoever. The silence, the shyness, and the supposed lack of intellectual capacity were entirely trauma-based symptoms caused directly by the relentless daily emotional abuse inflicted upon this innocent child by Desmond and Beatrice Pierce. Away from their toxic elite mansion and free from their constant cruel belittling remarks. My son's voice was utterly flawless, brilliant, and full of undeniable human courage. Desmond stumbled backward, trying to scramble to his feet, his expensive shoes slipping clumsily on the expensive rug as pure blinding panic completely overrode his rapidly failing mind. He began to stutter and stammer, desperately trying to backtrack, waving his hands frantically as he aggressively told the judge that the boy was lying and that I must have illegally coached him to recite those specific words just to ruin his custody chances today. But as Desmond raised his voice, his carefully constructed mask of the doting, gentle father completely dissolved, revealing the aggressive, volatile, and incredibly cruel true nature he had kept hidden behind his fake aristocratic charm for years. He lunged toward Leo, pointing a shaking, furious finger at his own son, yelling at the boy to shut his mouth and stop making up ridiculous garbage, forgetting where he was and who was watching him. The true ugly face of the abuser was finally laid bare, entirely exposed to the bright, harsh light of the legal system, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that everything Malcolm Green had argued in the courtroom was a massive, fabricated, disgusting lie designed to trap me in endless financial servitude. The court stenographer did not miss a single frantic, aggressive syllable, typing furiously, as Desmond continued to dig his own permanent grave with every desperate, furious word falling from his trembling, pathetic lips. Judge Vance's face underwent a terrifying, rapid transformation, shifting from an expression of stunned disbelief into a mask of pure, unadulterated, fiery rage. The red flush of furious embarrassment crept rapidly up the judge's thick neck, taking over his face, turning his skin beet red as the humiliating realization that he had been so easily manipulated by a federal criminal washed over his conservative mind. The judge had almost handed an innocent, vulnerable child over to a vicious emotional abuser simply because he had occasionally drank expensive champagne with the boy-corrupt grandmother at country club charity events. The sheer professional humiliation and the intense righteous fury completely consumed the older man. Judge Vance slammed his hands down onto his mahogany desk, pushing himself up from his heavy leather chair with such sudden violent force that the chair rolled backward and crashed loudly against the wooden bookshelves lining the back wall of the chambers. He did not say a single word to Desmond, refusing to even acknowledge the pathetic man's existence anymore. Judge Vance reached down and grabbed his heavy wooden gavel, his knuckles turning stark white from the intense pressure of his furious grip. He stormed past the sweating, stammering criminal on the floor, marching with long, heavy strides directly toward the heavy wooden doors leading back into the main courtroom. He threw the heavy oak doors wide open, marching straight back up to his high wooden bench with his furious beet-red face and his burning eyes locked exclusively on the respondent table, radiating an absolute terrifying aura of total judicial destruction. Judge Vance stormed back into the main courtroom with intense, furious energy that the heavy wooden doors violently slammed against the walls, echoing like a thunderclap through the cavernous space today. His face was a terrifying shade of dark crimson, radiating an absolute pure righteous anger that instantly silenced every single person in the room. He marched up the wooden steps to his high bench, moving with a heavy, aggressive determination that made the entire judicial platform shake slightly under his weight. The court bailiff quickly followed behind him, looking extremely tense and highly alert, sensing the massive legal explosion that was about to detonate right now. Darius and I remained perfectly still at the petitioner table, keeping our posture completely straight and our expressions entirely neutral, though my heart was beating a rapid, triumphant rhythm against my ribs, knowing that my sweet son had just delivered the ultimate fatal blow to the Pierce family legacy. Desmond stumbled back into the courtroom. A few moments later, looking completely disheveled and terrified, his cheap gray suit jacket hanging loosely off his shaking shoulders as he scrambled back to his seat next to his defense attorney, Malcolm Green. Malcolm took one look at the blistering fury burning in the eyes of the conservative judge and instantly knew that his incredibly arrogant foolproof plan had just failed spectacularly in the private chambers. Panic immediately washed over the greasy lawyer face, but he tried to salvage his rapidly sinking ship by jumping to his feet and slamming his hands down on the respondent table. Malcolm shouted out a frantic, desperate legal objection, pointing a shaking finger across the aisle at me, accusing me of engaging in severe parental alienation and malicious psychological manipulation today. The sleazy lawyer frantically claimed to the court that the minor child was clearly legally compromised, arguing fiercely that I must have spent the last 3 months aggressively coaching my 5-year-old son to recite those specific damaging words in a deliberate, calculated attempt to completely ruin his loving client chances of securing fair joint custody right now. Desmond nodded vigorously, along with his lawyer. Pathetic lies, crossing his arms over his chest and attempting to look like a deeply wounded, victimized father who was being viciously attacked by a heartless corporate monster. Judge Vance did not even allow Malcolm Green to finish his desperate, pathetic sentence before grabbing his heavy wooden gavel and bringing it down violently against the sounding block with a massive explosive crack that sounded like a gunshot in the tense, silent courtroom. The older conservative judge ordered the defense attorney to shut his mouth immediately and sit down right this very second, threatening to throw Malcolm into a holding cell for judicial contempt if he dared to utter another lying syllable today. Malcolm instantly froze in absolute sheer terror, his mouth snapping shut as he slowly sank back down into his wooden chair, completely abandoning his client in the face of the judge, terrifying, unbridled fury. Judge Vance leaned forward over his high mahogany bench, his piercing, angry eyes locking entirely onto Desmond Pierce, projecting a level of deep personal disgust and profound professional hatred that made the former chief executive officer shrink down into his seat. The judge picked up the thick, bound prenuptial agreement that Malcolm had arrogantly submitted an hour ago, the exact same fraudulent document containing the archaic, disgusting legacy clause designed to steal my son and force me into permanent financial servitude. Judge Vance held the document up high in the air for the entire courtroom to see his hands shaking slightly, with pure, unadulterated anger, before he grabbed the top pages and viciously tore the entire contract completely in half. The sound of the thick, expensive paper ripping echoed loudly through the room as the judge threw the shredded pieces of the fake prenuptial agreement directly into the garbage can, sitting beside his desk, letting everyone present know exactly what he thought of their pathetic illegal manipulation. Judge Vance stated in a booming, authoritative voice that he had presided over the Fulton County Family Court for more than 3 decades, and he had never in his distinguished career witnessed such a profoundly disturbing level of arrogant, narcissistic parental cruelty. He completely eviscerated Desmond, looking down at the trembling, ruined man and declaring that the absolute sheer audacity required to submit a blatantly forged legal document while simultaneously facing massive federal charges for severe corporate fraud was mind-boggling, but using an innocent child as a weapon was entirely unforgivable today. The judge continued his relentless verbal and legal assault, stating clearly for the official court record that the private in-chambers interview with the minor child had been illuminating and profoundly heartbreaking. He confirmed that the 5-year-old boy, who was supposedly suffering from a severe speech delay caused by a working mother, was actually an incredibly articulate, highly intelligent, and deeply observant child, whose only actual psychological defect was the massive, intense anxiety caused by his paternal family. Judge Vance outlined the horrific reality of the situation, explaining that the child-perfect speech only faltered when he was subjected to the constant degrading emotional abuse and severe psychological terror inflicted upon him by Desmond and Beatrice Pierce over the past 5 years. The judge told the silent courtroom that the boy had bravely and flawlessly recounted the exact cruel words his father had spoken on the morning after Christmas, completely destroying the fake narrative of the doting, loving family man. Judge Vance looked directly at Desmond and stated that any man who would deliberately step on his own son, handmade holiday card, and tell the boy that the world was better off without him was not a father, but a vicious emotional terrorist who possessed absolutely zero redeeming maternal or paternal qualities whatsoever today. Desmond let out a pathetic whimpering sound, sinking even lower into his chair, his hands covering his sweating face, as the last remaining fragments of his elite societal standing were completely pulverized into dust by the very same conservative judge he thought he could easily manipulate and control. The judge declared that the actions of Desmond Pierce constituted the most severe, devastating form of emotional child abuse and extreme parental alienation, completely voiding any fundamental rights he might have previously held as a biological parent under the laws of the state of Georgia right now, forever. Darius sat perfectly still beside me, a small, satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth as we watched the arrogant, wealthy abuser get absolutely destroyed by the exact legal system he had tried to weaponize against a woman from the South Side. I kept my expression totally blank, allowing no emotion to show on my face, even though a massive, overwhelming wave of pure, sweet vindication was rushing through my entire body, confirming that my precious son was finally completely safe from their toxic, aristocratic poison forever right now today. Judge Vance straightened his posture, adjusting his black robes as he prepared to deliver the absolute, final, binding legal resolution that would permanently seal the fate of the ruined Pierce family legacy in this courtroom today. The judge declared in a booming final tone that based on the overwhelming, undeniable evidence of severe emotional abuse, blatant legal fraud, and extreme paternal unfitness, he was officially awarding the petitioner Naomi Pierce 100% sole legal and physical custody of the minor child, Leo Pierce, effective immediately, without any requirement for parental consultation or shared decision-making ever again. Furthermore, the judge stated that he was permanently and entirely stripping Desmond Pierce of all his biological parental rights, completely terminating any legal connection he had to the boy, ensuring he could never again use the family court system to harass, intimidate, or extract resources from my son or my incredibly successful corporate empire. Desmond let out a loud, agonizing gasp, clutching his chest as the reality of losing his ultimate bargaining chip completely shattered his delusional, greedy mind, leaving him totally isolated and entirely powerless. But Judge Vance was absolutely not finished delivering his massive judicial punishment today. The judge turned his attention to the specific financial demands Malcolm Green had so arrogantly outlined earlier regarding the ridiculous request for massive monthly spousal support to maintain Desmond's luxurious, unemployed lifestyle. Judge Vance let out a sharp, humorless laugh, staring down at the pathetic fraudster, and officially denied every request for alimony, spousal support, or financial maintenance, claiming that a man who actively attempts to defraud the court and emotionally destroy his own offspring is entitled to absolutely nothing but a cold jail cell. The judge then ordered Desmond to pay 100% of my exorbitant legal fees entirely out of his own non-existent personal pocket, completely ignoring the fact that the man was already totally bankrupt and facing decades in federal prison for massive corporate tax evasion and wire fraud. The brutal financial ruling ensured that if Desmond ever somehow managed to earn a single honest penny for the rest of his miserable, pathetic life, it would be immediately seized and transferred directly into my corporate accounts, leaving him utterly destitute, completely ruined, and entirely dependent on the harsh, unforgiving prison system for his basic daily survival right now, forever today. Judge Vance picked up his heavy wooden gavel one final time, looking down at the ruined, pathetic man shivering at the respondent table, and slammed it down against the sounding block with a massive, definitive crack that officially closed the case and finalized my absolute freedom from the toxic, aristocratic nightmare of the Pierce family. The loud echo of the gavel was immediately followed by the heavy thud of the courtroom doors opening as two large armed federal bailiffs marched down the center aisle, moving with strict military precision to escort Desmond directly back to the secure federal holding facility where he would await his imminent criminal trial for his massive financial crimes. Malcolm Green hastily packed his briefcase and practically ran out of the courtroom, abandoning his ruined client without a single word of comfort or legal advice, entirely eager to distance himself from the monumental, humiliating disaster that had just occurred. The federal bailiffs grabbed Desmond firmly by his upper arms, hauling him roughly out of his wooden chair and preparing to drag him away to a miserable concrete cell. Desmond suddenly snapped, completely losing his mind, as the horrifying reality of his totally destroyed life finally broke through his arrogant delusions, causing him to drop to his knees, right there on the dirty courtroom floor, directly in front of the petitioner table. He ignored the firm grip of the federal bailiffs, looking up at me with tears streaming rapidly down his sweating, gaunt face, sobbing pathetically as he desperately begged me for forgiveness, pleading with me to use my massive corporate wealth to bail him out and save him from the terrifying federal penitentiary. The man who had spent 5 years treating me like a worthless working-class servant was now groveling at my designer heels, crying like a helpless infant completely broken. I slowly stood up from my chair, looking down at the weeping, pathetic fraudster who used to be my husband, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, detached indifference. I smoothly leaned down toward him, completely ignoring the federal bailiffs, and reached out my hands to gently straighten the rumpled collar of his cheap gray suit jacket, making sure he looked perfectly presentable for his long journey to federal prison today. I leaned in close so only he could hear my voice dropping to a smooth, icy, lethal whisper as I looked directly into his terrified, tear-filled eyes and delivered the final, absolute, fatal blow to his shattered ego right now. "I told you, Desmond," I whispered softly, perfectly echoing his own cruel, arrogant words from that freezing Christmas morning. "It really is better without you two today." 1 exact year had passed since the heavy wooden doors of the Fulton County Family Court had slammed shut behind the utterly broken and completely defeated Desmond Pierce, forever sealing the absolute destruction of his corrupt aristocratic dynasty and cementing my total undeniable freedom. The oppressive, suffocating humidity of the previous summer had long since faded, giving way to a crisp, bright, and incredibly clear Atlanta morning that felt like a brilliant promise of endless possibilities. Sitting behind the massive, polished mahogany desk in my expansive corner office, I looked out through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, watching the golden sunlight gleam across the sprawling, modern skyline of the city I had completely conquered. If anyone looked up at the towering glass and steel skyscraper that housed my operations today, they would no longer see the old, faded, arrogant letters of Pierce Holdings staining the facade. Instead, they would see a massive, gleaming new corporate logo, glowing proudly and boldly against the bright blue Georgia sky, reading NP Global Restructuring, a permanent, towering monument to the working-class girl from the South Side who had systematically dismantled a century of toxic old money entitlement. My private office was a perfectly curated space, reflecting quiet, authentic power with sleek, modern furniture walls lined with ethical corporate awards and absolutely zero traces of the fake, pretentious opulence my former mother-in-law had always desperately clung to. I was currently reviewing the final binding documents for a massive corporate acquisition deal that would fundamentally reshape the commercial real estate market in the Southeast region. But unlike the predatory, destructive tactics favored by the former Pierce regime, my new holding company focused exclusively on ethical, sustainable developments that actively revitalize struggling local communities without displacing the vulnerable families who lived there. I signed my name across the bottom of the final contract, executing the multi-million-dollar deal with a smooth, steady hand, feeling a profound sense of genuine accomplishment that had absolutely nothing to do with seeking the validation of pathetic, worthless people. I set my expensive pen down on the smooth leather desk pad and leaned back in my ergonomic chair, letting out a slow, deeply satisfied breath as I reached for the small remote control resting near the edge of my desk. I pressed the power button and the large flat-screen television mounted on the far wall of my office hummed softly to life, automatically tuning into the local Atlanta daytime news broadcast, just as a highly anticipated special investigative segment began to play across the high-definition screen. The polished female news anchor was standing outside a heavily fortified federal penitentiary, delivering a comprehensive one-year retrospective on the spectacular public downfall of the once untouchable Pierce family empire. The news segment featured stark, depressing video footage of Beatrice Pierce, looking incredibly frail-aged and completely stripped of her former aristocratic glamour, wearing a standard-issue drab orange jumpsuit as she was escorted through a harsh concrete prison courtyard. The reporter confirmed that the disgraced matriarch was currently serving a brutal 10-year federal sentence for massive tax evasion and severe wire fraud, having lost every single legal appeal and completely failing to manipulate any judges into granting her an early medical release. Beatrice spent her days scrubbing cafeteria floors and eating terrible processed meals, a permanent agonizing nightmare for a woman who used to fire personal chefs if her champagne was not chilled to the exact perfect temperature. The broadcast then seamlessly transitioned to a deeply satisfying update regarding Trent Sterling, showing a series of official court documents confirming the arrogant hedge fund manager had been officially convicted of federal corporate espionage and massive underground money laundering. Following his lengthy prison sentence, Trent had been permanently and unceremoniously deported back to his home country, absolutely forbidden from ever stepping foot on American soil or participating in any domestic financial markets ever again, completely destroying his entire professional and personal life forever. The news segment cut to a grainy, heavily zoomed-in photograph of Desmond Pierce, looking entirely unrecognizable, with his head completely shaved and his face gaunt, working diligently in the humid, suffocating prison laundry room, washing stained bedsheets and dirty uniforms for violent federal inmates. The man who used to complain about the aesthetic quality of my innocent child handmade holiday card was now spending 18 hours a day, inhaling the sickening smell of industrial bleach and raw sweat, completely isolated, entirely bankrupt, and utterly forgotten by the high society circles he used to proudly rule. I watched his pathetic, miserable face on the screen, feeling absolutely no pity, no sadness, and no regret whatsoever, because he was simply reaping the exact terrifying harvest he had so greedily sown. The reporter wrapped up the segment by showing a brief, humiliating clip of Camille Pierce, who had somehow managed to completely avoid federal prison, only to find herself living in a completely different kind of agonizing daily torture. The camera showed Camille wearing a cheap, poorly fitted uniform, standing strictly at attention behind the marble reception desk of the exact same elite Buckhead country club where she used to sneer at the hardworking service staff and sip expensive martinis with her wealthy, delusional friends. The footage captured a wealthy patron snapping her fingers impatiently at Camille, ordering her to fetch a fresh towel, and Camille was forced to bow her head, swallow her massive pathetic pride, and silently obey the humiliating command, or risk losing her minimum wage job and being thrown out onto the street instantly. I turned off the television, feeling a deep, profound sense of complete holistic justice, knowing that every single toxic member of that abusive household was now permanently trapped in a hell of their own making, completely incapable of ever causing harm to me or my precious son again. I stood up from my luxurious desk, smoothing down the crisp lines of my tailored power suit, and walked out of the massive corner office, moving gracefully through the bustling executive floor where my highly paid employees were working diligently to expand our ethical business acquisitions. The atmosphere was charged with positive energy, a stark, beautiful contrast to the lazy, corrupt environment that used to poison this exact building. I stepped into the private executive elevator and pressed the button for the main lobby, watching the digital numbers count down rapidly as I prepared to close out my busy, successful workday and begin my favorite part of the afternoon. The polished steel doors slid open with a soft, quiet chime, revealing the grand, expansive marble lobby of the corporate headquarters, where the late afternoon sun was streaming beautifully through the glass walls. Standing in the center of the lobby, completely surrounded by an aura of pure, innocent joy, was my magnificent 6-year-old son Leo, waiting patiently with his trusted private nanny beside him. Leo looked up, and his bright brown eyes instantly lit up with sheer radiant happiness when he saw me walking toward him. He dropped the nanny hand and ran directly into my open arms, holding a brand new, beautifully framed piece of colorful artwork he had proudly made at his progressive private school earlier that afternoon. Leo held the heavy frame up high, looking me dead in the eyes with absolute total confidence, and spoke with perfect crystal-clear articulation, telling me he painted a beautiful castle just for me, because I was his favorite superhero in the entire world. His flawless speech and his beaming, self-assured smile brought a sudden rush of warm, happy tears to my eyes, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that removing him from his father, toxic, abusive presence was the absolute best decision I had ever made. I took the beautiful artwork from his small hands, thanking him profusely and telling him it was the most spectacular painting I had ever seen, promising to hang it directly behind my desk, where everyone could admire his incredible talent forever. I took my son by his small hand, feeling the solid, comforting warmth of his grip, and together we walked gracefully through the heavy glass doors, stepping out into the bright sun of the bustling Atlanta afternoon. A sleek black town car was idling quietly at the curb, ready to take us back to our peaceful, secure home, entirely away from the ghosts of the destroyed Pierce dynasty. As I helped Leo into the comfortable back seat of the luxury vehicle and climbed in beside him, I looked back one final time at the towering glass skyscraper that now rightfully bore my own name, feeling a profound sense of absolute finality. I had not only completely burned down the corrupt, rotting legacy that desperately tried to bury me and silence my child, but I successfully built a massive, untouchable new empire for us from its ashes, proving that the most perfect, sweet revenge is a beautiful, successful, undeniable reality. The greatest lesson I learned from completely dismantling the toxic Pierce family empire is that your true worth is never defined by the people who desperately try to keep you at the bottom for years. I allowed arrogant old money elites to mock my working-class background and emotionally abuse my innocent child because I thought maintaining a polite family image was the right thing to do. But walking away from that burning midtown penthouse and standing victorious in federal family court taught me that true power does not come from inheriting a prestigious last name or holding on to generational wealth. Real power comes from setting absolute unyielding boundaries and having the sheer courage to walk away from anyone who treats you like an option or an inconvenience. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the exact monsters you need to ruthlessly protect yourself and your children from. You do not have to accept scraps of conditional love from manipulative abusers just because you share a marriage certificate or family ties. The absolute sweetest revenge you can ever achieve is not just destroying their corrupt world, but building an entirely new, untouchable empire of your own today. If this story of survival and sweet revenge resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, sharing your own journey of overcoming toxic relationships in the comments below.